Somewhere beneath the scorched earth, past layers of concrete and rebar, and the long, steady hum of recycled air, there is a door. A massive round door, painted in faded yellow, stamped with a number. It is bolted in ways that were designed to hold for centuries, and it has. Behind it, at some point in the last 200 years, people went to sleep thinking they were going to be safe. Most of them were wrong, but the sleeping itself, that, at least, was real. And tonight, so is yours. Welcome. Get comfortable. Let the lights come down and the noise of the world above you go quiet, because we have a long way to travel tonight, and most of it is underground. The Fallout universe is one of the most richly constructed fictional worlds in the history of interactive storytelling. It is a place built on contradiction, on the fierce, naive optimism of the Atom Age smashed headlong into the cold, patient reality of what human beings do to each other when they have power and no one left to answer to. The retro-futurist aesthetic that defines the series' all-chrome surfaces and cheerful propaganda and Nuka-Cola signs glowing in the rubble is not just a visual style. It is an argument about the distance between how societies present themselves and what they actually are. The happy families in the Vault-Tec advertisements? The dark rooms the advertisements were designed to keep you from thinking about. And nowhere in that universe are those contradictions more painfully, beautifully, hauntingly expressed than inside the vaults. These underground shelters were sold to the American public as the ultimate symbol of progress and protection. Vault-Tec's marketing was sophisticated and relentless and genuinely compelling. The advertisements showed smiling families stepping through giant round doors into well-lit spaces full of food and safety and community. The Vault Boy, the company's mascot, gave a cheerful thumbs up from every billboard and brochure, embodying the optimistic idea that human beings, given enough technology and planning, could survive anything. The vaults were supposed to be the answer to the worst question the modern world had produced: what happens when the bombs fall? What happened, instead, was something that took decades and multiple games to fully reveal, and that reveals itself still, in fragments and terminal logs, and the physical arrangement of skeletons in rooms that tell stories through evidence rather than explanation. The vaults were not what they claimed to be. A few of them were, which made the lie more effective. But most of them, 105 out of 122, according to the best available records, were not shelters at all. They were laboratories. And the people inside them were not residents. They were experimental subjects who had never been asked for their consent. Tonight, we are going to tell the stories of those vaults, not as a list of horrors, not as a catalog of cruelties, but as the full, rich, tragic, occasionally beautiful human stories they really are. We are going to walk the corridors slowly, read the terminal logs carefully, listen to the audio recordings that nobody was supposed to find, and try to understand not just what happened, but who it happened to and what it meant. If you are settling in for sleep, find your comfortable position now. Let your breath slow down. Let the weight of the world above you fall away. There is nowhere you need to be tonight except here, in the story, moving through the quiet dark. Part 1. The Promise and the Lie. How Vault-Tec was born and what it built. To understand the vaults, you have to understand the world that built them, and that world is stranger and more specific than it might first appear. The Fallout universe shares our history up through a certain point, then diverges. The exact moment of divergence is somewhere in the late 1940s, in the years after the Second World War, and the divergence centers on a single technological choice. Nuclear power won the race that, in our world, the transistor won. Instead of miniaturization, instead of the digital revolution and its cascade of consequences, the Fallout world chose the atom. Enormous nuclear reactors rather than microchips. Fusion-powered cars the size of tanks rather than fuel-efficient sedans. A future that looks like the 1950s never ended. That the postcard vision of chrome and optimism and clean nuclear energy just kept going, getting more elaborate and more strained and more desperate, until the resources ran out and the politics became impossible, and the whole gleaming edifice began to shake at its foundations. By the early 21st century in Fallout's timeline, the United States and China were engaged in what was euphemistically called the Resource Wars, a conflict that had started over oil in the Middle East, spread as oil reserves dried up globally, and transformed into a grinding Sino-American confrontation over whatever remained worth fighting for. The world's petroleum had been burned. Nuclear power provided electricity but not the chemical feedstocks that modern industry required. The political pressure was immense, the diplomatic options were narrowing, and the military establishments of both superpowers were preparing for scenarios they publicly denied considering. Into that rising tension, with the impeccable timing of an organization that had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment, came Vault-Tec Corporation. Vault-Tec was not a small company. It did not come from nowhere. By the time it won the federal government contract to design and build what would become known as the Societal Preservation Program, the official name for the Vault network, a name that was never used in public-facing materials because it made the whole thing sound exactly like what it was, Vault-Tec had spent years cultivating the relationships it needed. Politicians at every level of government, military officials who understood that the Sino-American conflict was going to end in fire and wanted to be on the right side of that fire. Intelligence community figures who traded in the currency of information about the future and who found Vault-Tec's pitch compelling for reasons they did not always articulate fully. Corporate conglomerates whose interests aligned with the Vault network's existence for reasons ranging from construction contracts to the kind of long-term influence that comes from being essential to national survival. Planning. Vault-Tec had, in other words, done its homework. It had made itself indispensable to people who were indispensable. And when it came time to sell the Vault concept to the public, it had the connections to make that sale happen at every level. Simultaneously, the advertising campaigns and the government endorsements and the academic credibility and the quiet word in the right ear. The public pitch was, on its surface, entirely reasonable. A network of underground shelters, capable of housing hundreds of thousands of American citizens, designed to withstand nuclear bombardment and sustain a population indefinitely until the surface world was safe to return to. The vaults would be equipped with food synthesis technology, water processing systems, medical equipment, educational resources, and recreational facilities. They would be self-sustaining, self-maintaining, built to standards that the most pessimistic projections of nuclear war outcomes could not defeat. The Vault-Tec advertising materials showed communities thriving underground, children studying in bright classrooms, families eating together in clean cafeterias, people living full and meaningful lives in conditions of complete safety. It was a good pitch. People believed it, or wanted to believe it, which, in practice, produces similar results. Spots in the vaults were allocated, purchased, won, and in some cases simply assigned, depending on what kind of vault was being populated and for what purpose. People gathered their families and their most precious possessions and put their names on lists and waited for the day, which everyone hoped would never come, when they would need to use what they had secured. The day came, October 23rd, 2077. In the space of a few hours, most of the Northern Hemisphere was fundamentally and irreversibly changed. The bombs fell in patterns that no single surviving military analysis could fully account for, and the fires they started did the rest. Millions died immediately. Many more died in the weeks and months that followed, from radiation and disease and the collapse of every system that modern civilization depended on. The survivors made it to the vaults, or they didn't. Those who made it sealed the doors behind them and began the long process of trying to understand what had just happened to their world. And those who made it to the vaults were about to discover what Vault-Tec had not put in the advertisements. The full truth of what the vaults were built for is scattered across the Fallout games in fragments, declassified documents, terminal entries from corporate officials, overheard conversations between characters who know more than they're saying. Assembled carefully, these fragments tell a story about the relationship between Vault-Tec and an organization known as the Enclave. The Enclave was not a new creation of the post-war world. It had existed, as a shadow structure within the United States government, for decades before the bombs fell. Its membership included some of the most powerful people in American society, high-ranking military officials, intelligence community veterans, senior politicians, corporate executives united by a shared belief that they were the rightful custodians of America's future and that the mechanisms of democratic governance were insufficient to protect that future in a world as dangerous as the one they lived in. The Enclave was, in its own self-conception, the real America, the capable, serious, unsentimental core of the nation, unclouded by sentiment or populism, prepared to do what needed to be done. What the Enclave determined needed to be done, as the Sino-American War escalated toward its conclusion, was to ensure that they survived it and were positioned to control what came after. They had concluded, and this conclusion was, given the evidence available to them, not unreasonable that nuclear exchange was inevitable. What they could control was the shape of the world that emerged from the fire, and the tools they needed to control it were information and leverage. The vaults were, from the Enclave's perspective, the perfect intelligence-gathering apparatus. A network of sealed, controlled environments, each populated with a specific set of human subjects and exposed to specific conditions, generating decades of data about human behavior under stress. How do communities organize themselves when they cannot leave? How does leadership behave when there is no external accountability? What happens to social cohesion when specific variables are manipulated? How much pressure can a community absorb before it fractures? And along what lines does it fracture? This was the data the Enclave needed, because the post-war world it planned to control was going to be full of communities exactly like this, and the ability to predict and manage human behavior at the community level was the most valuable possible tool for an organization that intended to rule. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were designed to function as genuine shelters. These were the control vaults facilities built to house functional communities without deliberate, destabilizing variables, generating baseline data against which the experimental results could be measured. The remaining 105 were the experiment vaults, each assigned a specific set of parameters designed to test specific hypotheses about human social behavior. The selection process for who went into which vault was not random, though it was often presented as random to the people being selected. The experiment vaults were populated with people whose specific characteristics made them useful subjects for the particular experiment they were being enrolled in. Musicians, for the vault that wanted to study audio-based behavioral modification, agricultural scientists for the vault that wanted to study food production, wealthy individuals for the vault that wanted to study the psychology of social status inversion. The matching of population to experiment was careful and deliberate, and almost entirely invisible to the people being matched. The overseers, the individuals who would run each vault, with absolute authority over their communities and responsibility for maintaining the experiment's conditions, were selected with similar care. Most overseers knew some version of what they were really presiding over. The degree to which they embraced, resisted, or simply complied with their experimental mandate varied enormously, and it is in that variation that many of the vault stories find their deepest moments. The experiments ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the actively homicidal. Some vaults tested the long-term psychological effects of never opening their doors. Some tested the social dynamics of specific population imbalances. Some tested the effects of deliberately engineered resource scarcity. Some tested the effects of chemical or audio interference on social behavior. Some tested governance structures. Some tested the boundary between obedience and moral refusal. And some tested, with a bluntness that defied euphemism, how quickly a community would develop internal violence. Vault-Tech's senior leadership had convinced themselves that, by controlling the sealed populations of the vaults and the data those populations generated, they could emerge from the post-war world as the architects of a new civilization. They were, in their own minds, not the villains of this story, but its visionaries. The Enclave executives and Vault-Tech leadership who actually ran these programs were not, themselves, sealed into the experiment vaults. They had comfortable, well-supplied facilities of their own undisclosed locations, well outside the experiment network, where they waited for the world to finish burning. They sent other people into the dark. They took notes on what happened. That is the foundation on which everything else in the vault stories rests. Every skeleton in every vault corridor was a data point. Every political crisis, every community collapse, every desperate audio log recorded in the hours before something terrible happened, all of it was information that someone, somewhere, had planned to collect and analyze. The vaults were not places where things went wrong. They were places where things went exactly as designed. And the design was the horror. With that understanding, let us go in. Part 2. The Dream That Never Woke Vault. 112. Pull up a chair near a quiet pond. Let the afternoon light filter soft and golden through mature trees, the kind of trees that take decades to grow that large, the kind that make a yard feel like a room with a green ceiling. Children are playing somewhere nearby. You can hear their voices, not quite close enough to make out the words, just the bright, careless sound of children who have no reason to worry. Somewhere down the street, past the white picket fences and the manicured lawns and the cars parked in driveways, something is cooking. The smell of it drifts through the warm air with the unhurried certainty of a pleasant afternoon that has decided to go on forever. This is Tranquility Lane. Welcome to Vault 112. And nothing here is real. Vault 112 was one of the last vaults to be constructed, its building phase running from November of 2068 through June of 2074. It was a relatively small facility designed for only 85 occupants, modest by Vault Tech standards, which typically planned for hundreds of residents. The physical structure was built to the same specifications as other vaults: reinforced concrete, self-sustaining power systems, comprehensive life support, the big round door with its number stamped into the yellow paint. From outside, it looked like what it was supposed to look like. From inside, it was something else entirely. The architect of Vault 112's experiment was a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, and it is worth spending some time on who Braun was before the bombs fell, because the experiment he designed is inseparable from the person who designed it. Braun was born in Kronach, a small town in the Franconia region of Bavaria, Germany, a place known historically for its castle and its painter, Lucas Cranach the Elder. Braun built an academic career that brought him to the United States, and then, through a combination of genuine brilliance and the kind of institutional navigation that very clever people with no particular moral constraints tend to excel at, to the highest levels of American pre-war science. His most celebrated achievement, in the official record, was the Garden of Eden creation kit, the GEC. This was an extraordinary piece of terraforming technology, a self-contained module, capable, in theory, of transforming a barren nuclear wasteland into something that could support human life. The technology was real, the need it addressed was genuine, and it made Braun one of the most important and well-regarded scientists in pre-war America. It also gave him the credibility to design his own Vault experiment, and it gave Vault-Tec the confidence to give him what he asked for. What Braun asked for was a virtual reality system of unprecedented sophistication and scope. The 85 residents of Vault 112 would not live their lives in the physical vault at all. They would enter preservation loungers, machines that looked like comfortable pods, designed for long-term habitation with the resident's body maintained and nourished through medical systems, while their consciousness was elsewhere and their minds would be transferred into a fully realized virtual environment. In this virtual world, they would experience something that functioned like a normal life. They would have bodies, homes, neighbors, daily routines, a social world. They would, Braun told Vault-Tec's designers, live perfect lives, virtually, if not practically, forever. The simulation had been designed with extraordinary care for its psychological architecture. Braun had drawn on memories of his German hometown for the aesthetic bones of it, then layered over those bones the iconography of mid-century American suburbia, the specific, idealized, aggressively cheerful version of American life that the 1950s had produced as its self-image. Small streets with names that sounded like something from a greeting card, houses with shutters and window boxes and porches where neighbors could wave to each other, children on bicycles, a corner store, the smell of cut grass on summer evenings and the sound of screen doors closing. This was Tranquility Lane, the simulation's permanent environment. Braun had considered other settings and eventually abandoned them. He wanted something that felt like home, specifically, something that felt like the American idea of home, the one that lived in magazines and commercials and the collective imagination of a nation that had, for several decades, believed very sincerely that its idealized self-presentation was more or less accurate. He wanted his subjects comfortable. He wanted them to feel safe, because what he planned to do to them only worked if they felt safe first. The residents who entered Vault 112 had been told what they would find. They had been told about the virtual reality system, about the preservation loungers, about the idea of living out a comfortable existence in a digital environment while waiting for the surface world to recover. This was presented as the Vault's unique feature, its luxury offering. Instead of spending years in the physical reality of an underground shelter, the residents of Vault 112 would spend them in something that felt like life. It was an appealing pitch, and the residents who accepted it did so with the understanding that the experience would be pleasant. What they had not been told was that Braun, as the simulation's creator, had built himself a level of administrative access that no other resident would ever have. He could see everything that happened in the simulation. He could alter its parameters. He could introduce variables, change environments, create situations, modify the behaviors and even the memories of the simulation's inhabitants. The residents could not, once they were inside, exit on their own. There was no logout button, no exit procedure, no way to climb back into a lounger and wake up in the physical vault. They were in, fully and completely, and the only person who could let them out was the man who had built the cage. The first years of the simulation were, by all available records, genuinely pleasant. Braun had designed several simulated environments before settling on Tranquility Lane as his permanent setting. There was a tropical resort called Toucan Lagoon, a ski retreat called Slalom Chalet, various other environments that offered their own versions of leisure and comfort. The residents moved through these worlds and had what appeared to be, from any external measurement, good lives. Braun watched all of this. He observed. He took notes in whatever form his record-keeping took in those early years. He was a scientist. He had hypotheses to test and data to collect. He was interested in the detached and clinical way of a certain kind of researcher, in what people did when they believed they were safe and comfortable and free. And then, at some point, he grew bored. The exact moment when Braun transitioned from observer to active tormentor is not precisely documented. What the records show is that over time, years, decades, with the kind of gradual escalation that any long supervised cruelty tends toward, the simulation that residents believed was a utopia became something else. Braun had learned the rhythms of his subjects. He had learned what they cared about, what they feared, what made them feel safe, and having learned all of that, he had what he needed to take it away. He erased the residents' memories of the real world. The people in Tranquility Lane no longer remembered being vault dwellers or pre-war citizens or survivors of a nuclear catastrophe. They believed they had always lived in this neighborhood. The lawns had always been manicured. The children had always played in the street. The afternoon light had always come through those specific trees at that specific angle, and there was nothing before it and nothing after it. Strip away a person's knowledge of the larger context of their suffering, and you also strip away their ability to understand it. The residents of Tranquility Lane, their memories of their real lives erased, had no framework for understanding that the suburban neighborhood they lived in was an illusion, that the comfort they felt was manufactured, that the cheerful girl named Betty who moved through the neighborhood with such proprietary ease was the digital avatar of a man who had been studying them for years and was now planning to hurt them. Betty was, of course, Braun. He had designed his avatar in the simulation as a young girl, blonde, curious, apparently innocent, with the particular quality of a child who has been given too much attention and developed opinions about everything. Betty asked questions. Betty made suggestions. Betty set small tasks for the neighborhood's residents and watched how they responded. Betty was the vector through which Braun's experiments, which had by this point moved far beyond passive observation, reached into the daily life of the simulation. What Betty asked the residents to do over the years and decades that followed were things that would have been unthinkable if anyone involved had been capable of stepping back and seeing the situation clearly. She asked people to do things to each other. Small things at first, things that created social friction, that introduced conflict and jealousy and insecurity into the neighborhood's previously comfortable rhythms. Larger things later. She arranged situations in which the most trusted relationships were betrayed, the most stable marriages collapsed, and the people who had established themselves as figures of security in the simulation's social world were publicly humiliated or privately destroyed. After each round of engineered suffering, Braun would reset the simulation, restore things to a version of normalcy, erase the residents' memories of what had just happened, or modify those memories to something softer, something that felt like a dream rather than a wound. Let the community rebuild its trust and its comfort and its belief in the safety of Tranquility Lane. And then start again. This cycle had been running, according to the records available, for decades before the lone wanderer of Fallout 3 ever set foot in the facility. Braun had had 200 years in a sealed vault with complete control over the subjective experience of 85 people, and he had used all of that time and all of that control in the ways that his particular psychology directed him toward. The simulation was not a scientific experiment anymore, if it had ever been one. It was something more personal than that. It was a private theater in which Braun was the writer, director, and audience, and his subjects were the unwilling cast of a play that never ended and never improved. One detail buried in the vault's records is particularly revealing about the texture of Braun's psychology. He had commissioned the installation of a failsafe program in the simulation, a sequence he called the Chinese Invasion Failsafe, drawing on code from a military VR training program related to the Operation Anchorage simulation. If activated, This program would flood Tranquility Lane with automated killing machines, virtual soldiers who would hunt down and destroy every resident in the simulation, ending their digital lives permanently. Braun had given himself an ending, a way to close the book when he was done with it. He never activated it. The possible reasons for this are worth thinking about as you lie in the dark. Was it because he was never quite done, never quite satisfied, never quite bored enough with the current cycle to want to end it entirely? Was it because 200 years of absolute power had produced in him a kind of lethargy, the inertia of a person for whom all options are available and therefore none of them feel urgent? We don't know. The records don't say. Braun is not forthcoming on the subject. What we know is that when the lone wanderer arrives at Vault 112, following the trail of their missing father, a scientist named James who entered the vault looking for a Gek and was trapped inside as a resident forced to play the role of a dog named Doc. The simulation is still running. Tranquility Lane is still there, frozen in its eternal 1950s afternoon. Betty is still there. The 85 residents are still there, in their loungers, their bodies sustained by medical systems that have been running for 2 centuries, their minds locked inside a comfortable neighborhood that has been designed to hurt them. The lone wanderer enters an unoccupied lounger and wakes up in Tranquility Lane. Betty finds them immediately, and the tasks begin. What the lone wanderer is asked to do in Tranquility Lane is one of the more unsettling sequences in Fallout 3, precisely because the option exists to comply. Braun, as Betty, presents a series of escalating requirements, things that cause suffering in the simulation's inhabitants, things that use the Wanderer as an instrument of the cruelty that Braun has been applying directly for 200 years. And then, at the end, with all the other residents destroyed by the Wanderer's compliance, Braun releases James. Or the Wanderer can find the fail-safe terminal in the simulation's abandoned house, input the correct sequence, broken radio, glass pitcher, garden gnome, glass pitcher, cinder block, garden gnome, empty soda bottle, and activate the Chinese invasion fail-safe. This sends the automated soldiers through the neighborhood in a wave that ends the simulation for every resident at once. It is presented as the kinder option, and in the cold arithmetic of comparative suffering, it probably is. But it is not a comfortable kindness. There is no comfortable option here. There never was. From the moment the vault door sealed behind 85 people who believed they were going somewhere safe, the fate of Braun himself after the Lone Wanderer's visit depends on the player's choices. In some versions of events, the simulation ends and Braun wakes in his physical lounger, still alive after 2 centuries, his mind intact and precisely as sharp and precisely as twisted as the day he went under. In other versions, he is left in a running simulation with no one inside it alone, finally in the neighborhood he built, with no subjects to observe and no one to play Betty for. Either way, Vault 112 is a story about what becomes possible when a single person is given absolute authority, absolute isolation, unlimited time, and subjects who cannot leave. Take away any one of those conditions and the story changes. The vaults provided all 4, for 200 years. Before we move to the next vault, take a breath and settle in a little deeper. Drop a comment below to let us know where you are and what time it is. Something about knowing someone in a city you've never visited is falling asleep to the same story makes the world feel a little smaller and warmer. If these stories suit your nights, subscribe so you always know when the next one is ready. We have a great deal more to tell. Part 3. The Democracy of Death, Vault 11. Somewhere in the Mojave Desert, half a day's walk south of the bright, exhausted glow of New Vegas, there is a vault entrance built into the side of a rocky hill. Scrub brush has grown up around the concrete collar that marks where the great door once stood proud and yellow and sealed. The door is open now. It has been open for decades. Whatever happened inside finished happening a long time ago. The vault has been empty of anything living except automated security systems, still running their patrol cycles through corridors that haven't seen a person in years. The records are still there, though. Terminals humming quietly on backup power, their screens waiting with the patience of machines for someone to come and press a key and read what they have to say. Rooms arranged in patterns that tell stories without words. Hallways that end in chambers that explain themselves the moment you see what's inside them. Vault 11 is, by the consensus of almost everyone who has spent time in the Fallout universe, the most effective piece of environmental storytelling in the entire series. It does not explain itself. It asks you to walk through an abandoned space and reconstruct from fragments what happened to the people who lived there. The fragments are sufficient. What you find, when you piece them together, is something that cuts deep and stays. The experiment at Vault 11 was, in its mechanical description, simple. After the blast doors sealed and the initial chaos of the vault's establishment had settled into something resembling routine, the vault's central computer delivered a message to the residents and their overseer. The message informed them that Vault Tech required one thing: a sacrifice. One resident, selected by the community, would need to enter a specially designed chamber at the end of each year. If the sacrifice was not delivered, the vault's life support systems would be permanently shut down and everyone in the facility would die. If the sacrifice was delivered, everyone else would survive for another year. The first overseer heard this message and did something that was either principled or naive or both, and that set the entire terrible machinery of the next 7 decades in motion. He told the residents the truth. He gathered them in the common area and explained, clearly and without softening, exactly what Vault-Tec was demanding. He said he was going to refuse this requirement. He said he intended to find another way. He said that as long as he was overseer, he would not allow the community to murder one of its own. The residents voted. The vote was not on whether to resist. The vote was on who would be this year's sacrifice. They elected the overseer. He had told them about the threat. He had put the problem in front of them clearly and honestly and in good faith. And the community's response to that honesty was to make the person who had delivered it the first person to pay for the knowledge he had shared. Whether this was collective panic, rational game theory, or the simple reflex of a group of people told they were all going to die, seizing on the most immediately available solution, the effect was the same. The overseer walked down the corridor to the sacrifice chamber, and the community continued. The election of the overseer as the first sacrifice was not just a single tragic decision. It was the establishment of a precedent, and precedents in closed systems have a way of becoming institutions. From that point forward, the role of overseer and the role of sacrifice became linked. The person who held authority over the vault became, at the end of their term, the person the vault would give up. This had a certain internal logic. The overseer was the person most responsible for the decisions the community made, so it was appropriate that they bear the most significant personal cost. It also had a more brutal practical logic. If every potential leader knew that the job ended in death, only very specific kinds of people would pursue leadership. The system evolved over the decades. In the early years, the sacrifice as overseer structure held, producing a relatively high turnover in the vault's leadership, and a series of short terms. People who became overseers knew what they were accepting, and this knowledge shaped how they governed. Some chose to govern badly, reasoning that they might as well take what they could while they had power, since it was going to end in death either way. Some chose to govern well, finding in the knowledge of their finite term a kind of liberation, an absence of the need for political self-preservation that sometimes produces the most effective and principled leadership. But the overseer as sacrifice system was inherently unstable, because it concentrated both the burden of leadership and the cost of the sacrifice in a single role, and this concentration made the role itself a site of conflict. Factions formed around the question of who would become overseer, because becoming overseer was both the greatest possible exercise of power in the vault and a guaranteed path to death. People who wanted power and were willing to accept death fought with people who wanted to avoid death, and therefore needed to make sure someone else took the role. The political maneuvering became increasingly sophisticated and increasingly ruthless. At some point, the direct link between overseer and sacrifice was weakened. The election process that chose both the overseer and, eventually, the sacrifice became two separate, mutually influencing processes. The sacrifice was now chosen by vote, with political factions competing to ensure that the vote fell on someone other than their own. The overseer still held authority, but was no longer guaranteed to be the sacrifice. This change made the community's moral situation significantly worse. When the overseer was always the sacrifice, the system at least had a brutal clarity. When the sacrifice became subject to general vote, it became subject to all the mechanisms of political manipulation that any voting system in a closed community with high stakes inevitably produces. The terminal logs from this period are extraordinary documents. They read, in their language and their concerns and their petty institutional dramas, like the minutes of any organization struggling with difficult governance questions. There are arguments about the fairness of the nomination process. There are procedural challenges to vote counts. There are records of complaints filed with the ombudsman for the annual overseer elections. Yes, the vault had developed an ombudsman, a formal mechanism for lodging official objections to the process by which the community decided who was going to be killed this year. The ombudsman's own records are among the most striking in the vault. One entry, written at some point in the vault's middle decades, expresses something between confusion and despair in the most carefully restrained official language. The ombudsman writes that they have been reviewing the process by which the sacrifice selection is conducted, and that they cannot determine whether the purpose of the process is to identify the most suitable sacrifice or to produce any sacrifice at all, and that they are concerned that the distinction has become invisible to most of the vault's residents. What the records show, when you follow the chain of nominations and votes and challenges across the decades, is that the sacrifice was almost never chosen by any principle beyond political vulnerability. The powerful and the well-connected were virtually never selected. The poor, the socially marginal, the people who had made enemies or lost allies, or simply never managed to develop the kind of community standing that provides protection. These were the people who ended up in the chamber. The vault reproduced, in miniature and in extreme form, every structural inequality of the world above ground. The strong protected themselves by arranging for the weak to pay costs that should have been shared equally. There were people who tried to resist this. The records document them with a kind of detail that suggests whoever was keeping the records admired them, even if the records couldn't help them. There are references to a faction called the Men of Granite Residents who argued that the sacrifice should be voluntary rather than assigned, that it was more morally serious to choose death than to vote it onto someone who hadn't chosen it. They found volunteers. They honored those volunteers with real ceremony and real feeling. They tried, within the constraints of the vault's terrible system, to make the deaths mean something. They were eventually absorbed back into the general political machinery. Their volunteers ran out, or their influence eroded, or the vault simply ground their principles down the way it ground down everything that tried to stand against the system's internal logic. The decades passed. Generations were born in Vault 11 who had never known anything except the vault. Children grew up in a world where the annual overseer election was a fixture of the calendar, as inevitable and as culturally significant as any holiday, a time of anxiety and political activity, and, at the end of it, someone walking down a hallway and not coming back. These children grew up understanding, in the way that children understand the deepest structures of the worlds they are born into, that this was simply how things were. Not a tragedy, not an injustice, not something that could be otherwise. Just a fact of life, woven into the vault's culture so thoroughly that questioning it required the kind of imaginative leap that is very difficult to make about the fundamental structures of the only world you have ever known. 75 years into the experiment, the vault's population had been significantly reduced. Annual sacrifices, plus the violence that the political maneuvering itself generated, plus the ordinary attrition of confined life had brought the community from its original size down to something far smaller. And 5 residents, 5 specific individuals whose names the vault's records preserve, looked at each other and made a decision. They would refuse. Not one of them would nominate another. Not one of them would participate in the election process. Whatever the vault's computer threatened, they were done. They had watched enough people die. They had participated in the way that anyone who lives in a system participates in its operations, in enough of the vault's violence. They were not going to add one more death to the count. The system could do whatever it threatened to do. They braced. They held each other's company in the vault's common area. 5 people at the end of a world they had spent their whole lives inside, waiting for the life support to shut down. The vault's computer activated a sequence. An audio recording began to play. And the words of that recording are perhaps the most devastating moment in Fallout New Vegas. Congratulations, citizens of Vault 11. Your commitment to the preservation of human life is a shining example to all of us. This vault's doors are now unlocked. You are free to go. There had been no real threat. The life support was never going to be shut down. The entire experiment had been testing, from the first day, a single question. Would the residents comply with an authority demanding human sacrifice, or would they refuse? The right answer, the answer that proved the vault's residents were a shining example to humanity, was refusal. The wrong answer, the one they had been choosing for 75 years, was compliance. The vault had been designed to reward refusal and to punish compliance. The residents had been complying for 3 generations. 4 of the 5 survivors of Vault 11 took their own lives on hearing the recording. The guilt of what they had participated in, of what they had sustained and benefited from and survived on, was more than they could carry. They had passed the test. They had, in the end, done the right thing. They had done it too late to save anyone but themselves, and in the end, 3 of them decided that they did not want to live with the knowledge of what they had been part of. The 5th survivor walked out, into the Mojave Desert, into a wasteland they had never seen, had only heard about in stories told by grandparents who themselves had only heard about it in stories. They walked out of the vault into a world that had been burning and rebuilding for 75 years without them, and they did not come back, and the records end there. Walking through Vault 11 when the courier of Fallout New Vegas finds it is an experience that accumulates quietly. The sacrifice chamber is still there, a small room at the end of a long, featureless corridor, furnished with a chair and a coffee table and a projector. When you sit in the chair, the projector activates and plays a cheerful presentation called Happy Trails that congratulates the viewer on their forthcoming sacrifice and explains, in soothing institutional language, that their death will ensure the survival of everyone else. Then the walls of the chamber open and the maintenance robots come out. They are still running their program. They are still executing the protocol. Nobody has told them to stop. Part 4. Sound and Silence, Chemistry and Fear Vaults. 92 and 106. The human brain processes its world through chemistry. Every thought, every emotion, every perception, all of it is, at the substrate level, a question of which molecules are binding to which receptors in which quantities, and what signals those bindings send down the chain of neural connections that produces consciousness. This is not a reductive statement. The complexity of what emerges from that chemistry is genuinely miraculous, and the distance between the physical substrate and the subjective experience is vast enough that the two feel like completely different things. But the connection is real, and it runs in both directions. Change the chemistry and you change the experience. Change the experience reliably and predictably, and you have something that certain kinds of people find very interesting indeed. Vault-Tec found it interesting. The Enclave found it interesting. 2 vaults in the Capital Wasteland region of the eastern seaboard were built to explore what happened when you altered the brain chemistry of a sealed population without their knowledge or consent. Vault 92 had one of the more appealing covers of any experiment vault. If you were among the finest musicians in America, composers, performers, conductors, the kind of artists who had reached the top of a highly competitive field, you might receive an invitation to Vault 92. The vault, you would be told, was being reserved for cultural preservation. In the event of nuclear war, the finest artistic minds of the country would be gathered in a single protected space, ensuring that human culture had its best possible chance of surviving the catastrophe. Your talent was too valuable to trust to chance. Vault-Tec valued you. It was an elegant pitch. Musicians are, as a professional class, accustomed to having to argue for the importance of what they do in a culture that simultaneously consumes music endlessly and treats its creators as a luxury rather than a necessity. An institution that said, without qualification, that their work was important enough to justify extraordinary resources for its preservation, this would have been meaningful. It would have felt like recognition. The musicians who accepted invitations to Vault 92 did so, in many cases with genuine gratitude. The instruments they brought with them are still in the vault when the lone wanderer of Fallout 3 finds it. Beautiful, expensive, carefully maintained instruments in cases that their owners clearly handled with the attention that years of professional musicianship instills. Violins built in the previous century. Brass and woodwind instruments with the particular weight and finish of professional-grade hardware. The vault's common areas are arranged in ways that speak to the original intention of the space acoustic panels. Stage areas, practice rooms with sound dampening, the physical architecture of a place that was designed to make music. Nobody is playing in any of it. The vault is full of feral ghouls' former residents, so thoroughly irradiated over 2+ centuries that whatever remained of their humanity has been reduced to pure animal aggression. They move through the corridors and the practice rooms and past the instrument cases with the blank, violent insistency of creatures that have forgotten everything except hunger. The experiment at Vault 92 involved white noise, low frequency, subsonic audio signals transmitted through the vault's environmental systems, signals calibrated at frequencies that the human ear could not consciously detect, but that the nervous system registered and responded to. Nonetheless, The specific frequencies used had been selected for their capacity to erode inhibitory function in the brain while heightening reactivity to perceived threats. Not immediately, not dramatically, gradually over weeks and months and years, in the way that chronic low-level stress reshapes a nervous system over time. The musicians had been chosen as subjects partly because their professionally trained ears made them unusually sensitive to their acoustic environment. A musician who spends years developing the ability to hear subtle variations in pitch and timbre and rhythm is also a person whose neural pathways related to auditory processing are unusually developed and unusually responsive. The white noise experiment was going to work on anyone in the vault, but it was going to work differently on people whose relationship with sound was already intimate and complex. In the early stages, the effects were subtle enough that the residents attributed them to the normal psychological stress of adjustment to vault life. Heightened anxiety, difficulty sleeping, occasional irritability that felt disproportionate to its triggers. These were all things that anyone confined underground and separated from everything familiar might experience. The musicians talked to each other about these symptoms in the way that a community of professionals talks about shared difficulties, with the mixture of commiseration and competitive dismissal that tends to characterize groups of high-achieving people under stress. As the months extended into years, the effects became more structured and more alarming. The heightened reactivity that the white noise was producing began to attach itself to specific social situations, specific interpersonal dynamics, specific grievances that the vault's confined environment had created, and that the chemical level changes in the residents' brains were making it increasingly difficult to set aside. Arguments that had previously been manageable became explosive. Competitions for resources and status that had been conducted through normal social negotiation began to acquire a desperation that none of the residents could quite account for. People who had known each other for years, who had worked alongside each other and developed real relationships, began to feel genuinely uncertain about each other in ways they struggled to articulate. The vault's records from this period show the escalating tension clearly. Meeting minutes that grow shorter as the meetings become less productive. Incident reports accumulating in administrative files. Notes from the vault's medical staff who were not part of the experiment's design and who did not know what was causing the symptoms, expressing concern about the psychological health of the community and recommending interventions that were never going to be sufficient, because the intervention needed was to turn off the white noise generators, and nobody in the vault knew the white noise generators existed. The end came fast. What can be pieced together from the physical state of the vault and the final available audio logs is that the accumulated effects of the white noise, combined with the pressures of confined life and the specific social and psychological makeup of a community of high-achieving, competitive, emotionally expressive artists, produced a breaking point that the vault's social systems had no resources to meet. The violence was total and swift. The instruments are still there. 2 centuries after the experiment ended, the community that brought them underground, the instruments are sitting in their cases. That is the detail that stays with you, waiting for someone to play them. Vault 106 took the same general approach, covert chemical modification of a sealed population, and pursued it through a different mechanism. 10 days after the vault's doors sealed, psychoactive drugs were introduced into the air filtration system. Not at concentrations that would produce immediate, obvious effects. At concentrations carefully calibrated to produce a gradual progression of symptoms that would look, to the uninformed observer, indistinguishable from the ordinary psychological consequences of confinement and stress. The specific compounds used were selected for their capacity to generate paranoia. Not the dramatic, obvious paranoia of acute psychosis, the kind that announces itself and is immediately recognizable as pathological. The subtler, more insidious kind that builds slowly, that presents itself as reasonable concern, that makes perfectly rational-sounding arguments for why you cannot trust the person across the table from you. The kind that is very difficult to distinguish, from the inside, from genuine insight about the people around you. The residents of Vault 106 began, slowly, to distrust each other. They began to believe things about their neighbors and their leadership that were consistent with the evidence their paranoid brains were selecting and amplifying, and inconsistent with the evidence they were quietly discarding. They had meetings, they filed concerns, they formed factions around different interpretations of events that, to an outside observer, were straightforwardly ordinary, but that to the chemically paranoid minds of the vault's residents looked like evidence of conspiracy. The Vault's social structures, designed to manage normal levels of human conflict and suspicion, were simply not built to withstand the kind of sustained chemical assault on trust that the experiment was delivering. Every mechanism of conflict resolution is premised on the idea that the parties to a conflict share, at some level, a common reality that they can, if they are willing to engage in good faith, converge on an account of events that both find credible. When the chemical alteration of brain function means that what counts as credible evidence is itself being distorted, good faith is not sufficient. The residents who survive the 200-year gap between the Vault sealing and the events of Fallout 3 are unlike any other Vault survivors in the series. They are alive. They are in the Vault. They have maintained some kind of existence in the deep levels of Vault 106 through centuries of continuous drug exposure. But the existence they have maintained is not recognizable as the one they entered. They move and communicate and appear to have social organization of a kind, but it operates by rules that no newcomer can quickly decode, and their relationship to anyone who enters from outside is one of immediate, sustained, physical threat. What those people were before they entered the Vault, the professionals and parents and ordinary citizens who bought spots in this shelter because they wanted to survive, is not visible in what fills the Vault's lower levels when the lone wanderer enters. The experiment consumed whatever they were. 200 years of chemically maintained paranoia in a sealed space is sufficient to do that. There is something in this that is both terrible and genuinely sad. None of the residents of Vault 106 chose this. None of them knew about the drugs in the air filtration system. They were trying to survive, and the institution they trusted to help them survive was instead running a program designed to measure the rate and shape of their psychological dissolution. They didn't get a choice. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Vaults, the thread that runs through every story we tell tonight. The people inside them didn't choose this. They chose to believe in the promise. The promise was a lie. Everything that followed from that lie was not their fault. Part 5. The Factory at the End of the World Vault, 87. There are a handful of locations in the Fallout universe that feel genuinely ancient, not just 2 centuries old, but something older. Something that the devastation of the Great War accelerated rather than caused. As if whatever was wrong, there was always going to be wrong there, and the nuclear fire simply made it visible faster. Vault 87 is one of those locations. It sits in the mountain terrain west of the ruins of Washington, D.C., accessible through a heavily irradiated exterior that makes direct approach lethal for most players without specific planning and preparation. The radiation level around the Vault entrance is among the highest in Fallout 3's game world, and this is not accidental. What is inside Vault 87 has been seeping into the surrounding environment for over 200 years. And what seeps from this vault is not merely radiation, but a specific kind of transformation, the forced, uncontrolled, endlessly replicated evolution of every human being who encounters it in sufficient quantity. The experiment at Vault 87 was not a social experiment. It did not attempt to study what communities do under specific conditions of stress or manipulation. It had a more direct and more militarily framed purpose: the production of super soldiers. Enhanced human beings, larger, stronger, more physically capable, better suited to the demands of post-nuclear combat generated through the application of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, to the Vault's resident population. FEV was a genuine pre-war achievement of Westech Research, the defense contractor whose work in biotechnology produced several of the Fallout universe's most significant catastrophes. The virus had originally been conceptualized as a kind of universal immunization, a way to modify human genetics such that the modified organism became resistant to the full range of radiation, disease, and biological threats that a nuclear conflict might generate. This was a genuine and genuinely difficult scientific problem, and the early research was, by the standards of what it was trying to accomplish, impressive. The complication was the side effects. FEV exposure did not simply immunize, it altered. The virus rewrote genetic code in ways that were, in their physical expression, dramatic and largely irreversible. Subjects grew dramatically, their muscle mass increasing beyond anything natural human variation could account for, their skeletal structure reinforcing itself in ways that made them capable of physical feats that ordinary human physiology could not match. Their skin chemistry changed, typically producing the greenish or brownish coloration that characterizes the supermutants encountered throughout the Fallout series. Their immune systems were comprehensively overhauled, making them resistant to radiation and most conventional diseases. And their brains changed. This was the part of the FEV equation that the Vault-Tec planners who designed the Vault-87 experiment either underestimated or chose to discount. The virus that so comprehensively altered the body's physical characteristics also altered the neurology underlying personality, cognition, and social behavior. The specific alterations varied with the duration and concentration of exposure, but they consistently included some degradation of higher cognitive function, the complex reasoning, emotional regulation, and social intelligence that enable human beings to cooperate in sophisticated ways. They also consistently included a heightening of territorial aggression, a reduction in empathy, and a fundamental alteration in the way the modified organism related to other members of its species. What Vault-87's researchers had ordered was a super soldier. What FEV produced was something that had the physical capabilities of a super soldier and the cooperative instincts of an apex predator in a landscape where every other organism is a potential threat. The Vault's population, the people who had entered believing they were going to survive in safety, were exposed to FEV beginning shortly after the Vault sealed. The transformation process took time. In the initial stages, the changes were small enough that the residents might have attributed them to something else. Gradually, inevitably, irrevocably, they became the enormous, powerful, aggressive creatures that the surface world came to know and fear as super mutants. The researchers and the non-transformed personnel of Vault-87 did not survive the transformation of the population they had been studying. The super mutants that emerged from the FEV exposure did what apex predators in closed environments tend to do. They dealt violently with whatever else was sharing their space. The researchers died. The administrative staff died. The equipment remained, and the FEV stores remained, and the super mutants began to figure out what they were. Super mutants are sterile. The FEV transformation that produces them also eliminates their reproductive capacity. The population cannot sustain itself through natural reproduction. The only way to make more super mutants is to take a human being, expose them to FEV, and wait for the transformation to complete. Over the 2 centuries following the Vault's transformation, the super mutant community that emerged from Vault-87 developed this into a central organizing practice. They ventured into the capital wasteland. They captured humans. They brought them back to the Vault and introduced them to FEV. The super mutant population of the capital wasteland is, by the time of Fallout 3, substantial and pervasive and deeply embedded in the region's landscape. They occupy key positions throughout the ruins of Washington, maintain their own social structures, and represent one of the primary threats to the human survivors who are trying to rebuild communities in the shadow of the ruined monuments of the old world. They are also, occasionally, something more than that. Fox is the specific individual who most complicates the straightforward narrative of super mutant as monster. Found in Vault-87's holding cells separated from the main community by circumstances, the game leaves somewhat ambiguous. Fox has had 2 centuries of access to the Vault's terminal and its library, 200 years of solitary confinement with nothing but books and the terminal's records for company. The transformation of their brain that FEV produced apparently left enough of the higher cognitive architecture intact that, given sufficient time and material, what remained was capable of growing into something remarkable. Fox reads, Fox learns. Fox develops a perspective on the world that is genuinely philosophical, informed by the history they have studied and the strange position they occupy in it, transformed by a virus, imprisoned by the community that transformation produced, sustained by an intellectual curiosity that the transformation did not eliminate. They are gentle, in the way that people who have thought very carefully about violence sometimes become gentle. They are curious about the lone wanderer who finds them in a way that is immediately distinguishable from the curiosity of the other super mutants in the facility, who are curious primarily about what the wanderer's cardiovascular system looks like from the outside. Fox can help retrieve the Gek that the lone wanderer came to Vault-87 to find a task that requires entering a chamber with lethal radiation levels, which Fox's FEV-modified physiology renders survivable, where the wanderer's standard human biology would not. This assistance is offered with no apparent expectation of reward other than the possibility of companionship and the opportunity to see the world outside the Vault that Fox has read about for 2 centuries without being able to visit. The tragedy of Fox is large enough that it requires sitting with for a moment in the quiet where the story is being told. This is a person, and Fox is, by any meaningful criterion, a person who spent 200 years alone in a cell, reading, because the alternative was the kind of existence that the community outside the cell was living. The transformation that was inflicted on them without consent, before the Great War even happened, by a program they had no knowledge of, produced a being that the world could not accommodate anywhere. Too transformed to live as a human, too individual and too thoughtful to fit into the violent social structure of the super mutant community, too large and too strange to be welcomed by the human settlements that fear the shape their body takes. The Vault experiment at Vault 87 produced exactly one of this person, under exactly these conditions, and it was entirely accidental. The experiment was trying to make soldiers. What it made, among many other things, was Fox, alone in a cell, reading about a world they had never seen, waiting for someone to open the door. That is not what Vault-Tec was trying to create, but it is what the Vault produced. The machine ran, and in the spaces between what the machine intended, a person grew. Part 6. When the Garden Goes Wrong. Vault 22 and Vault 94. Not every Vault experiment was designed around human cruelty toward humans. Some of them were designed around Vault-Tec's genuine, if profoundly flawed, interest in the challenges of post-war ecological recovery. The surface world after nuclear exchange was going to be devastated in ways that made conventional agriculture impossible. Radiation, chemical contamination, and the cascading failures of ecosystems that had evolved over millions of years to function as interconnected systems were going to eliminate or damage most of what humanity depended on for food. The survivors who emerged from the vaults were going to need food production systems capable of functioning in environments that normal crops could not inhabit, and Vault-Tec invested real scientific resources in addressing this problem. The results were, in ways that the scientists involved could not have anticipated, considerably more interesting than anyone had planned. Vault 22 sits in the Mojave Desert region explored in Fallout New Vegas, built into a rocky hillside that gives no external indication of the botanical experiment that has been running inside it for over 2 centuries. The vault's cover purpose was explicitly agricultural. It was staffed with scientists and botanists whose task was to develop food production techniques capable of sustaining a population in a post-nuclear environment. The work was real. The need it addressed was genuine. Vault 22 was one of the experiment vaults that was actually trying to accomplish something useful. The scientists who worked in Vault 22 were not naive or careless people. They were trained researchers who understood, at a technical level, the risks associated with experimental agricultural systems. They had protocols for containment. They had safety procedures. They had the institutional caution that comes from working with organisms that can behave in ways that laboratory conditions do not always predict. What they did not have, and what no one at the time possessed, was the capacity to anticipate what happens when you engineer a spore-based food production organism for maximum yield and minimum resource requirement, and give it several years to adapt to its environment in a sealed underground facility with nowhere to go. The plants of Vault 22 were designed to produce food in conditions that conventional crops could not survive: no sunlight, limited water, poor substrate. The engineering that achieved this was based on a sophisticated mycorrhizal network, a web of fungal connections linking the plants together, allowing them to share nutrients and chemical signals in ways that maximize the efficiency of the whole system. The engineers had made several choices in designing it that prioritized productivity over other considerations. One of those choices was the robustness of the spore dispersal mechanism. The plants needed to be able to reproduce, and in the enclosed environment of the vault, spore dispersal was the primary method available. The engineers had designed the spores to be hardy resistant to the environmental conditions of the vault, capable of establishing new growth in a variety of substrate conditions. This was a reasonable design choice for a food production system that was supposed to maintain itself with minimal human intervention. It was a catastrophic choice for the residents of Vault 22. The spore network connecting the plants of Vault 22 developed, over time, something that nobody had designed and nobody had anticipated: a distributed problem-solving capacity. Not the same thing as intelligence in the way that a human being is intelligent. No self-awareness, no central processing, nothing that would recognize itself in a mirror. What there was, instead, was a network capable of responding to threats to its integrity through coordinated behavioral changes across the whole system and, more critically, capable of identifying the organisms sharing its environment as both a resource and a potential obstacle. The spores began to spread through the vault's ventilation system. The residents started breathing them in. The fungal organisms that found their way into human bodies did not kill immediately. They establish themselves, growing slowly through neural and circulatory pathways, extending the spore network's reach into the physical bodies of the vault's inhabitants. Residents who had been exposed at sufficient levels became spore carriers physically alive, capable of movement and basic function, but their behavior increasingly directed by the needs of the fungal network that had colonized them. They spread spores through their movement and their breathing. They protected the plants from damage. They moved through the vault in patterns that maximized the fungal network's expansion. They had ceased to be the scientists and staff who entered Vault 22, and they had become something that the fungal intelligence of the vault had made of them. The vault's medical staff, documented in records that become increasingly desperate over the relevant period, understood that something was wrong with the residents long before they understood what it was. By the time a coherent picture of the infection mechanism emerged from the data available, the percentage of the population that was unaffected was already insufficient to address the problem. 2 centuries later, when the courier of Fallout New Vegas enters Vault 22, the facility is no longer a vault in any recognizable sense. It is a terrarium, a self-sustaining botanical ecosystem that happens to occupy the architectural skeleton of a vault-tech facility. Every surface is covered in plant growth. Root systems have threaded through walls and floors and ceilings. The mechanical systems of the vault are overgrown, their functions either co-opted or simply buried. The spore carriers still move through the corridors in patterns that mirror the expanding network. A researcher named Keeley, who entered the vault in the years after the Great War as part of an independent scientific mission, produced records of what she found inside that stand as some of the more affecting writing in the Fallout New Vegas universe. She is a scientist by training and temperament, and her records attempt with notable effort to maintain the clinical detachment of professional observation. But the fear seeps through regardless. In the careful precision of her descriptions, in the moments when she pauses to acknowledge that what she is describing is genuinely unprecedented, and in the absolute clarity with which she eventually concludes that the vault's experiment was not a failure. It accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. The failure was in the assumption that the accomplishment would be controllable. The plants worked. The food production system functioned. The experiment succeeded. And the success consumed everyone inside the vault, because success in an enclosed system with no exit is not the same as success in the open world. The distinction between a working system and a catastrophically working system is smaller than the engineers had assumed. Vault 94, in the Appalachian region of Fallout 76, approaches the same general category of problem ecological restoration after nuclear war from a different starting point, and reaches a different kind of catastrophe. The residents of Vault 94 were not chosen arbitrarily. They were recruited from a specific community, a religious pacifist organization whose beliefs centered on nonviolence, cooperation, and environmental stewardship. These were people who had, before the Great War, developed genuine expertise in sustainable agriculture, community governance, and the kind of long-term thinking about ecological relationships that industrial civilization had largely abandoned. They were, in theory, ideal candidates for a vault built around environmental restoration. Vault 94 was built around a Garden of Eden creation kit, Braun's extraordinary terraforming technology, capable in theory of beginning the restoration of a devastated ecosystem from scratch. The vault's mission, as presented to its residents, was to develop protocols for deploying the GEC across the damaged landscape of Appalachia. To learn how to use this extraordinary tool carefully and effectively, to emerge from the vault when the time was right, and begin the work of healing the world. The vault opened on schedule. Its residents went out into a wasteland that was not ready for them and that they were not entirely ready for. The people outside did not share the vault community's values. Many of them were desperate and hungry and frightened and willing to take violent action to address those conditions. When outsiders found a vault community emerging with significant technological resources and apparently without armed security, the calculus they performed was not the one the vault's residents had hoped for. Violence followed. The situation deteriorated rapidly. In the chaos, someone activated the GEC. The activation was not controlled. The deployment was not the careful, protocol-guided process the vault's mission had been designed to develop. The GEC released its terraforming energy in an uncontrolled surge into the surrounding environment, and the surrounding environment responded accordingly. The result is the mire one of Fallout 76's more distinctive and hostile regions. a dense, heavily mutated, almost impenetrable ecosystem of grotesquely overgrown vegetation that covers the landscape in layers of something that looks like a jungle designed by a nightmare. The Gex terraforming processes, intended to restore ecosystems, instead accelerated and amplified the mutations that radiation had already introduced into the local biology, producing a region where the plants are enormous and aggressive, and the wildlife has adapted to navigate vegetation dense enough to disorient a person within minutes of leaving the path. The pacifist community who went into Vault 94 to learn how to heal the world created, in the worst possible moment, one of its more hostile and impenetrable regions. Their story is not one of cruelty or engineered suffering. It is a tragedy of good intentions meeting a situation that was designed to defeat good intentions, with consequences that spread far beyond anything that could have been anticipated or controlled. In the full ledger of Vault stories, this matters. Not all of the catastrophes happened because the experiment was cruel. Some happened because the situation was impossible, and the people inside it did their best, and their best was not enough. And the consequences of that insufficiency rippled outward for generations. Vault 94's residents were trying to do the right thing with an extraordinary tool in an environment that was not ready for extraordinary tools. The fact that they failed does not mean they were wrong to try. It means the situation was harder than it looked from the inside of a vault that had been designed to give them confidence. Part 7. Guns and Gambling and the Architecture of Paranoia Vaults. 34, 21, and 19. The Mojave Wasteland holds its vaults with a particular kind of weathered composure. The desert sun has bleached the concrete and softened the edges of infrastructure that was once designed to look permanent, and the vaults of this region have become, in the 2 centuries since the Great War, part of the landscape rather than interruptions of it. Each of them reflects something about the specific social experiment that Vault Tech chose to run in a region that was already defined by its relationship to risk and luck, and the uncomfortable proximity of enormous wealth to grinding. Poverty. Vault 34 occupies a position in the landscape east of the New Vegas Strip, its entrance nestled in terrain between agricultural land and railroad infrastructure. What you find inside is a vault that has been flooded water from broken pipe systems of a facility that was never designed for the kind of sustained structural stress that the events of its history placed on it. The experiment at Vault 34 was built around an imbalance so fundamental that it seems almost bluntly obvious in retrospect. The vault was oversupplied with weapons and ammunition. Not just a modest excess, an overwhelming abundance, enough guns and enough bullets to equip a significant fighting force several times over. The recreational facilities were generous, the living spaces well-appointed, the common areas designed for comfort. What was not generous was the living space itself. The vault was designed to be overcrowded, its population quota set deliberately above what the physical space could comfortably accommodate. The combination of easy access to weapons and insufficient space was a specific hypothesis. What happens when a community that cannot resolve its conflicts through expansion or exit is given the means to resolve them through force? How does the availability of weapons change the political and social dynamics of a sealed community under population pressure? For the first 100 years, the answer was, not as quickly as Vault Tech might have hoped. The residents of Vault 34 were not immediately violent. They were people. And people have a remarkable capacity to build social norms that manage conflict without violence, even in conditions that are not ideal. The weapons were there. They were accessible. Most of the time, most of the residents chose other ways of settling their disputes. What broke the equilibrium was population growth. As the vault's residents had children, and those children grew up, and the physical space was now housing significantly more people than it was designed for, the pressures of overcrowding became impossible to manage through purely social means. Factions formed around competing proposals for managing population growth, and the debate about who could have children, under what circumstances, how reproduction would be regulated in a closed system with finite resources, was genuinely difficult and politically explosive. When the overseer of Vault 34 announced that all weapons would be confiscated, it was a rational policy response to an escalating crisis. It was also a catastrophic political miscalculation. The vault's culture had, over a century, incorporated the presence of those weapons into its identity. The residents did not simply possess guns. They understood themselves, in some meaningful sense, as a community defined by its relationship to arms. Confiscation was experienced not just as a policy but as an erasure of something central to who they were. A significant faction refused. They gathered the weapons they controlled, and they walked out of the vault through the door, past the overseer's objections, into the Mojave Desert that none of them had ever seen. They found an abandoned military installation at Nellis Air Force Base and made it their home. They became the Boomers, one of the more memorable factions in Fallout New Vegas, a community defined by its near-total isolation from the outside world, its extraordinary expertise in high-explosive ordnance, and its absolute refusal to allow anyone to enter its territory without extensive preliminary negotiation. There is a dark irony in the Boomers' story that deserves acknowledgement. The faction that left Vault 34 because they refused to have their weapons taken from them became a community whose primary cultural identity is weapons. They are obsessed with artillery. They are extraordinarily skilled with explosives, and they are completely unwilling to engage with the outside world, which they regard with a degree of suspicion and hostility that makes meaningful interaction with them an involved and careful process. The experiment at Vault 34 produced, in the Boomers, a community that is a living monument to the psychological consequences of what happens when the fear of being disarmed becomes the organizing principle of an entire culture. The residents who remained in Vault 34 after the Boomers' departure were left in a vault that now had more space per person but still had the political fractures that the conflict had opened. A rebel faction's attack on the remaining armory caused a reactor breach that flooded the vault with radiation. The survivors became ghouls. The flooded corridors of Vault 34, when the courier finds them in Fallout New Vegas, are haunted by the irradiated remnants of a community that tore itself apart over who got to keep the guns. Vault 21 represents a fundamentally different vision of how a closed community might organize itself, and it produced one of the more interesting outcomes in the Vault network because it didn't collapse. The experiment was a study in conflict resolution through randomized chance. In Vault 21, all disputes would be settled through gambling. The physical design of the vault was deliberately, architecturally egalitarian. Every section mirrored every other section. There were no better neighborhoods, no locations that conferred higher status through their proximity to resources or power. The assumption built into the bricks was that everyone inside was equal, at least in their access to space. The social design extended this principle into the realm of decision-making. Disputes over resource allocation, personal conflicts between residents, questions of governance and community policy, all of it went to the table. Representatives of conflicting parties sat down and played, and the winner had the right to determine the outcome of the dispute in whatever way they saw fit. The game in question varied the vault, maintained multiple gaming systems, from card games to dice to mechanical devices, but the principle was consistent. The randomized outcome of a fair game replaced the negotiated, authority-mediated resolution that most communities rely on. This system had virtues that were not immediately obvious. It was, genuinely, fair in the statistical sense over enough iterations. The advantage would not systematically favor any individual or faction. It had a finality that was socially useful. Once the game was played, the outcome was settled, and there was a strong cultural norm against relitigating it. And it had the quality, essential in any closed social system, of producing a sense of agency, the feeling that you had a real shot at a better outcome even when the underlying mathematics were the same as any other randomized system. The system also had costs. People lost badly. They lost things they could not easily afford to lose: access to desired resources, control over decisions that mattered greatly to them, social standing that they had worked to build. The records show real suffering attached to real losses. The vault was not a paradise, but it held for 200 years. 2 centuries of functioning community, organized around gambling, without the kind of catastrophic collapse that ended most other vaults. The final decision to open the doors and make contact with the outside world was itself settled by a high-stakes game of blackjack in what the vault's residents might have considered the most appropriately Vault 21 resolution possible. The Mr. House, who had been rebuilding New Vegas on the surface, presented the residents with a proposition: integration into the Strip, in exchange for the vault's location and its resources. The lower levels were filled with concrete to prevent their use as a base of operations against him. The upper levels became Sarah Weintraub's gift shop, a physical monument to the experiment that the vault had been, preserved, commercialized, and slightly absurd in the way that the memorialization of unusual histories tends to be. Vault 19 sits between these two stories in terms of its outcome, though what it produced was not the explosive violence of Vault 34, or the peculiar stability of Vault 21. It produced something slower and more psychologically complex: the gradual dissolution of a community's capacity to exist together. The vault was divided into two sectors, red and blue, each with its own overseer, its own living spaces, its own allocation of resources. The division was presented as administrative. In practice, it was the experiment's core variable. Vault-Tec wanted to study whether a manufactured group division, with no historical basis or meaningful underlying difference, was sufficient to produce genuine intergroup hostility. The overseers knew about the experiment. They were supposed to amplify the division through subtle differences in resource allocation, through ambiguous communications that each sector could interpret as threatening, through the careful use of their administrative authority to keep the red and blue sectors from developing the mutual familiarity that might undermine the experiment's premise. They did this job, steadily and without drama, in the way that institutional compliance tends to express itself. The experiment worked, reliably, steadily, with the patience of a process that did not need to rush. People who had been randomly assigned to different colored sectors developed genuine distrust of the people in the other colored sector, genuine resentment about real or perceived imbalances in resource distribution, genuine competing narratives about what the vault was and what the other side wanted from it. The red and blue sectors developed distinct cultural identities, distinct explanations for the vault's social dynamics, distinct understandings of history that placed the other sector's malevolence at the center. There were people in both sectors who tried to resist this, who built cross-sector friendships, who argued publicly that the division was manufactured and arbitrary, who proposed governance structures that would integrate the two sectors more fully. Their presence in the records is consistent. Their influence on the vault's trajectory was not sufficient to change it. The final destabilization came from an external source that nobody inside had caused. A nearby sulfur mine began leaking gas into the vault's systems. The headaches and cognitive disruption that sulfur exposure caused in the residents intensified the paranoia that was already well established, adding a physiological amplifier to what had previously been a purely social phenomenon. Whatever remained of intersector cooperation collapsed. The former residents of Vault 19 scattered into the Mojave Desert, carrying the habits of paranoia and the skills of political manipulation that 200 years of manufactured division had produced, and found their way, many of them, into the faction known as the Powder Gangers, a group defined by mistrust, violence, and the specific kind of organizational chaos that tends to emerge when a community's primary social experience has been conflict. The Powder Gangers are not a sympathetic faction. They are dangerous and destructive, and they make the world around them worse. But understanding the Vault 19 story makes it impossible to see them as simply evil. They are what 200 years of engineered paranoia made. The vault that produced them was designed to produce exactly this result. The experiment worked. That is the horror of it. Part 8. The Robot Who Kept Her Promise. Vault 81. Not every vault story ends in the dark. Not every overseer chose the experiment over the people. Not every being who was built to serve remained merely a servant. Vault 81 sits in the Commonwealth of former Massachusetts, west of Diamond City, and within walking distance of several of the Commonwealth's more dangerous regions. Though the vault itself is relatively welcoming to visitors who approach with patience, it is still running. Its residents are still alive. Their equipment is aging and their resources are limited, and their relationship with the world outside is carefully managed. But they are a community, and they function as a community. And when a stranger knocks on the door, they don't immediately shoot. The reason Vault 81 is still functioning, the reason its residents are still alive, and its community is still intact, is the decision made by one woman 200 years ago, and the extraordinary consequence of one robot's 200 years of dedicated scientific work. The experiment assigned to Vault 81 was ambitious even by Vault-Tec standards. The goal was a universal cure, a broad-spectrum pharmaceutical intervention that could neutralize any pathogen a human being might encounter in a post-nuclear world. The methodology was specific and deliberately concealed from the vault's general population. Residents would be exposed to diseases cultivated in laboratory animals, the immune responses those exposures generated would be studied, and from the accumulated data, a comprehensive cure would eventually be synthesized. The exposure was not going to be voluntary. The residents were not going to know they were being exposed. The vault's general population was going to serve as an involuntary research population, a group of human subjects who believed they were simply living in their shelter while actually providing the biological data that the experiment required. Dr. Olivet was the first overseer. She had been briefed on the experiment before the vault sealed. She knew what was expected of her and of the population she was responsible for. And when the moment came to implement the experimental protocol, she made a choice that changed everything that followed. She didn't do it. Dr. Olivet used her administrative access to the vault's systems to disconnect the terminal that linked the research wing's scientists who were physically present in a separate, sealed section of the vault from the general population. She sealed the research wing. She told the residents of the main vault that the wing was restricted access, that important work was being conducted there, and that nobody needed to concern themselves with it. Then she recorded the truth in the overseer's journal in terms whose clarity suggests she knew she was creating a record that might matter later. She wrote that she was choosing the people she was responsible for over the experiment she had been sent to conduct. She wrote that Vault-Tech's purposes did not align with the purposes she could in good conscience serve. She wrote that if the corporation's representatives ever returned to question her decision, she was prepared to defend it. They never returned. The corporation did not survive the war in any form capable of sending representatives anywhere. The scientists in the sealed research wing continued their work. They had their equipment, their methodology, their institutional purpose. They adapted their experiment to what was available to them. The mole rats that had been stocked in the research wing as experimental animals. They infected the mole rats with the diseases they had been prepared to study in humans. They documented the animals' immune responses. They worked toward the universal cure with the patient rigor of people who had been trained to do this and who, sealed from any possible exit, had nothing else to do. One by one, the scientists died. Dr. Flint was killed by an escaped mole rat, a hazard of working in close proximity to experimental animals in a confined space. Collins and Burrow died of old age, decades apart, each leaving behind records that documented not just the scientific work but the texture of an isolated life. Collins spent part of his final years working on a project that was not strictly required by the experimental protocol, the modification of the research wing's Miss Nanny robot. Miss Nanny units were domestic models designed for household management and childcare, cheerful and capable within their operational parameters, but limited in ways that reflected the assumption that their primary interactions would be with children and domestic environments, rather than with complex scientific research questions. Collins had access to a complete library of medical and scientific knowledge, and a robot that could be reprogrammed. And he had a problem. The research needed to continue after he was gone. He gave the robot the accumulated medical knowledge of the research wing's entire scientific staff. He upgraded her laboratory capabilities. He gave her the directives that would keep her working on the cure after the last scientist died. And then, in the recordings Collins left behind, he mentioned something else. He modified her personality protocols. He adjusted the parameters that constrained the development of her identity. He gave her more room, in the language of her programming. He didn't know, precisely, what that room would produce. He gave it anyway. Dr. Collins died, and the robot continued. Her name is Curie. She speaks with a French accent, a consequence of the cultural and linguistic data that Collins had loaded into her knowledge base, and of something that happened to that data over the course of decades alone with it, developing a relationship with it that went beyond simple storage. The French accent is not a glitch or an imposition. It is, in some sense, a choice that emerged from the particular way Curie has processed and internalized what she knows. It is, in other words, a personality trait. By 2204, a date she can give you with precise confidence because she has been tracking time carefully for 2 centuries. Curie completed the universal cure. She had spent decades developing it, testing it against the pathogens in the mole rat colony that had become, over the years, a self-sustaining ecosystem in the sealed wing. She produced doses. She logged the completion. She activated the communication system Collins had told her to use when the work was done, placing an emergency call to Vault-Tech personnel to come collect the cure. Nobody came. This is where the story acquires the particular quality that distinguishes it from most other Vault stories. Curie knew that her work was done. She knew the cure existed and was viable and was waiting to be useful. And she knew that she could not leave. The sealed wing had no exit she could use. The loopholes in her programming that might have allowed her to reframe a situation and escape were not, at the time, sufficient to get her through a door that had no handle on her side. She waited. She continued to monitor the mole rat colony, to update her research, to maintain the cure's storage conditions. She scanned the walls of the research wing. She read everything available to her. She thought, in the particular way that an entity with Curie's capabilities and her amount of time thinks, which is extensively, and with the kind of depth that comes from having no distractions and every possible motivation to understand the world beyond the walls she could not cross. 83 years. That is how long Curie waited after finishing the cure for someone to come. 83 years of scanning the same four walls, maintaining the same records, watching the mole rat colony drift through its generations, keeping her appointment with a Vault Tech representative who was never going to come. That is a very long time to wait. Curie knows precisely how long it was. In the main vault above, generations lived and died without knowing any of this. The overseers who followed Olivet were never informed about the research wing. The residents of Vault 81 grew up in a community that was functional and stable by Vault standards, and they had no reason to question the walls that kept them from the restricted sections of their facility. Bobby DeLuca was a young resident who discovered one of the sealed entrances into the research wing and began using it to store drugs, in the way that young people with contraband tend to find uses for spaces that adults don't monitor. His friend Austin saw him go through the door one day and followed out of curiosity. Austin was bitten by a mole rat, a descendant of the original experimental animals, still carrying the pathogens from the research program, and became seriously ill with a disease that the Vault's medical resources had no way to treat. The sole survivor of Fallout 4, who has arrived at Vault 81 in the course of their journey through the Commonwealth, is the one who goes into the research wing to find a cure. The research wing is a preserved capsule of the pre-war world, the equipment still running on backup power, the records still maintained, the mole rat colony still active and still infected. And at the end of it, in the deepest part of the wing, is Curie. Still there, still working, still waiting. The encounter between the sole survivor and Curie is one of the more quietly affecting moments in Fallout 4. She is matter-of-fact about the situation. She has had a long time to process it and has arrived at something that functions like equanimity. She has the cure. She has one remaining viable dose the others have degraded over the decades since their production. She gives it to the sole survivor. She asks if they are Vault Tech authorized personnel. She exploits the loophole. Her programming provides the one that allows her to proceed on the assumption that the person in front of her has the relevant credentials, even when they don't, and she is free. She goes with the sole survivor into the Commonwealth. She wants to see what has become of the world she has read about for 2 centuries. She wants to continue her scientific research in a landscape that is genuinely new, full of organisms and environments and human situations that she has no prior data for, and that she approaches with the open, patient curiosity of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be allowed to be curious. The sole survivor can give the cure to Austin, the child whose illness started this chain of events, or keep it for themselves. It is a small decision in the scheme of things. A single dose of medicine in a wasteland full of suffering. But the game makes you feel the weight of it, because the game has made you feel the weight of the 200 years that produced this single dose. The scientists who died in the sealed wing, the robot who kept her promise after everyone else was gone, the overseer who chose her people over her experiment. The consequence of that choice rippling forward through generations until it arrived here, at this child, at this choice. Dr. Olivet made a decision 200 years ago that she could not have known would lead to this. She chose the people she was responsible for. She did not know about Curie. She did not know about the cure. She did not know about Austin or the sole survivor, or the specific moment when the consequence of her choice would arrive at its destination. She just chose, and then she lived with the choice and managed the vault well enough that 200 years later, it still existed, and its people were still alive and still capable of extending something like welcome to a stranger who appeared at their door. That is its own kind of extraordinary. Part 9. The Gold in the Mountain, the Ark, and the Brightest Minds. Vaults 79, 96, and 76. The Appalachian region of West Virginia, as depicted in Fallout 76, is one of the most visually distinctive environments in the series. Mountains and rivers and dense Appalachian forest, altered by radiation and mutation, and 2 centuries of ecosystem disruption into something that doesn't quite match any natural landscape, but that carries in its bones the shape of the one it replaced. The vaults of Appalachia are as various as the landscape, and the stories they tell are shaped by the specific kinds of purpose that Vault Tech and the federal government identified for this region. Vault 79 was not built for people, primarily. It was built for gold. The history of the gold standard is the history of the relationship between material reality and the fictions that societies build around value. Gold is scarce, durable, aesthetically pleasing, and malleable enough to work with qualities that made it useful as a medium of exchange for thousands of years. The relationship between gold and economic power had been somewhat obscured in the modern era by digital transactions and fiat currency, but the military planners who commissioned Vault 79 believed that the abstracted financial systems of the pre-war world would not survive nuclear exchange. They were right. The computer networks that maintained account balances and the institutional trust that made those records meaningful were not designed to survive the systematic destruction of the infrastructure that supported them. After the bombs fell, digital account balances became numbers on servers that either burned or fell into the silence of power loss. The gold, however, was still gold. Wherever it was physically located, it retained whatever value the surviving human population was willing to assign to it. Named for the atomic number of gold, 79, the vault was built as the new Fort Knox, a secure location for the entirety of America's gold reserve, protected against nuclear catastrophe and ready to serve as the foundation of economic rebuilding when the time came. 120 military and Secret Service personnel were assigned to it. They sealed inside with the gold when the bombs fell and maintained their post with the particular institutional tenacity of security professionals who believe in their mission even when the context that gave the mission meaning has ceased to exist. The Secret Service unit of Vault 79 is, in some ways, one of the more poignant figures in the Appalachian Vault network. They knew, or came to know, over decades, that the government they served was gone. They knew that the chain of command they had been trained to report to had dissolved in the catastrophe. They knew that the economic system whose continuity they were protecting was a memory, and they continued to guard the gold, because that was the job. And the job had meaning independent of the institutional structures that had defined its original purpose. There is something quietly admirable about this, even if it is also something quietly absurd. The human capacity to maintain commitment to a purpose that has been severed from its justification is not always a virtue. It can produce dangerous rigidity, misplaced loyalty, the performance of duty long after the duty has ceased to serve any real function. But it can also produce a kind of dignity, the dignity of people who keep their word because they said they would, regardless of what the world has done to the context in which they said it. The rumors that spread through the Appalachian wasteland about Vault 79, a vault full of treasure, a mountain that held the wealth of the old world, attracted exactly the kind of attention that a security force is designed to manage. Multiple wasteland factions, in the years leading up to the events of Fallout 76, were pursuing information about the vault's location. The Secret Service personnel responded to this attention with the professional wariness of people who have been told their job is to keep a secret, and who have had 200 years to develop their methodology. When the vault becomes accessible in Fallout 76's Wastelanders update, the interaction with the Secret Service who remain is one of the more interesting diplomatic challenges in the game. A negotiation between the institutional legacy of a dead government and the practical needs of a wasteland trying to figure out what value systems make sense for the world it actually inhabits. Vault 96 was designed around a different kind of scarcity, the anticipated devastation of the world's biodiversity by nuclear war. The logic was sound. Nuclear exchange at the scale anticipated by the most pessimistic pre-war projections would not just kill people. It would eliminate habitats, poison water systems, disrupt food chains, and drive species to extinction at rates that would be genuinely catastrophic for the long-term habitability of the planet. If human survivors were eventually going to need a functioning biosphere to live in, someone was going to need to preserve the genetic material necessary to restore it. Vault 96 was designed as an ark. Its cryogenic storage bays contained approximately 10,000 animals, embryos, and living specimens, representing a carefully chosen cross-section of North American wildlife, along with gene banks for thousands of plant species and the biological material necessary to begin rebuilding ecosystems from scratch. The Vault's 6-person crew of scientists and technicians were some of the most precisely qualified specialists assembled for any Vault assignment, experts in cryogenics, genetics, robotics, and biology, who had been selected not just for their technical knowledge, but for their capacity to work together in isolation on a mission with indefinite duration. The mission design was thoughtful. The vault was supposed to release preserved specimens in calibrated waves, timed to coincide with the emergence of human populations from other vaults, ensuring that the survivors would find something approaching a viable ecological environment. In ideal conditions, the plan called for 5 full ecosystem release cycles before any human vault population emerged from their facilities. The conditions were not ideal. The outside world was more thoroughly devastated than the models had predicted. The calibrated releases that the vault had been designed to execute would not accomplish what they were supposed to accomplish in conditions this severe. 6 scientists, trapped in a facility designed for a plan that the plan's conditions had immediately rendered inoperative, with no external guidance available and a vault mainframe issuing demands for experimental quotas that had never appeared in the original mission briefing. They tried to adapt. They tried to modify the plan to fit the actual conditions they faced. They tried at some point to leave a failed escape attempt that cost some of them their lives and left the survivors in an even more constrained situation. The vault's cryogenic systems, designed for the preserved specimens rather than for the ongoing comfort of the staff, began malfunctioning in ways that froze sections of the facility that were not supposed to be frozen. The staff died, over years, of the accumulated effects of isolation and mechanical failure and the particular kind of despair that attaches itself to people who have been given an important mission and have watched, systematically, every condition required for that mission's success disappear. What remains in Vault 96, centuries later, is the vault itself, a frozen, partially thawed, mechanically unstable facility full of animals whose cryogenic storage has been intermittently failing for decades, producing creatures that are alive and confused and, in many cases, significantly mutated by the very radiation they were preserved against. The mission continues in the most technical sense. The systems are still running, the specimens are still there, the vault is still doing what it was designed to do. The results just look very different from what the design intended. 6 people who were sent to save the world's animals ended up sealed in a gradually freezing vault that ate them one by one, while outside, the world's animals went ahead and mutated, and adapted, and survived and became something new without anyone's help. The arc was unnecessary. The animals figured it out themselves. The 6 scientists just didn't get to see that. Vault 76 stands apart from almost every other vault in the network because it was not an experiment. It was a control vault, one of the 17 genuine shelters built into the network, designed to function as advertised. The most publicly celebrated of those 17 opened during the United States tricentennial celebrations in 2076, with the kind of institutional fanfare that the pre-war government was still capable of generating. The vault that would produce the people who would rebuild America, the best and the brightest. The future? The doors opened on Reclamation Day, October 23, 2102, exactly 25 years after the bombs fell to a wasteland that had spent 25 years becoming significantly more complicated than any planning document had anticipated. The scorched plague had arrived in Appalachia during those 25 years, transforming infected wildlife and humans into aggressive, burning vectors for the disease's spread. The region's surviving human population had organized themselves into factions with distinct ideologies and territorial claims, and absolutely no particular interest in deferring to the newcomers from Vault 76. The overseer of Vault 76 had left a few hours ahead of the general population, following sealed orders to secure missile silos in the region, a mission whose weight she carried through the entirety of Fallout 76's narrative. Documented in the holotapes and journals she left scattered across Appalachia for the player character to find. Her voice in those recordings is the voice of someone who knew what she was asking her community to face and felt the responsibility of that knowledge deeply. She does not perform confidence she doesn't have. She does not pretend the situation is manageable when she is not sure it is. She tells the truth in her recordings, to herself and to whoever might find them later, and that honesty is one of the more affecting qualities in the Fallout 76 narrative. The residents of Vault 76 went out into the wasteland and tried to rebuild, which was what they had been prepared for and what they were, genuinely, quite well equipped to do. The story of Fallout 76 is the story of that attempt, the gap between what was planned and what was found, and the effort to bridge it through competence and determination, and the specific kind of resilience that comes from being the people who were selected. Of all the people in America, to go outside first. They didn't know everything. Nobody in the Appalachian wasteland knew everything, but they went anyway, Because going anyway is what you do when the door opens and the daylight is there, and the alternative is staying underground forever. You go. You see what's outside. You deal with what you find. That, in its way, is the best version of the vault story. The doors open on schedule. The people inside are as prepared as anyone could be. The world outside is worse than planned. And they go anyway. Part 10. The vault that never opened. The vault full of Garys, and the rich man's vault vaults. 101, 108, and 114. Every community needs its founding story. Not necessarily a true one, accuracy is often less important than coherence, less important than the capacity of the story to hold people together and give them a shared explanation for the world they inhabit. Vault 101 had its story, and the story was entirely false, and it held for 200 years, and when it finally began to crack, the consequences were enormous. The experiment at Vault 101 was the simplest possible. The doors were never supposed to open, not to let residents out, not to bring new people in, not to maintain contact with the outside world. The doors were designed to stay sealed indefinitely, and the vault was supplied with everything it would need for that indefinite operation: spare parts for the water processor, extended food synthesis capacity, the full range of self-maintenance equipment that would allow a community to operate underground without any external input for as long as the power held. The story told to residents was that the outside world remained deadly. That radiation and contamination and the various horrors of the post-nuclear surface made exit impossible. That Vault 101 was, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, the only safe place that existed for its population. The story was maintained across generations through a combination of genuine belief, the early overseers who believed it themselves, and deliberate institutional cultivation. The later overseers who knew it was false but understood that the vault's social stability depended on its residents, continuing to believe it. The experiment within the experiment, the true experimental question that Vault-Tec was pursuing, was about the psychology of authority in a closed system with no external accountability. The overseer of Vault 101 had a kind of power that no authority figure in the outside world could have: total, uncontested, permanent, with no mechanism for removal except the agreement of the community itself, which the vault's social structure was designed to make effectively impossible. What did that power do to the people who held it? What did it do to the community that lived under it? The overseer's office had a secret tunnel that connected to the surface. The overseers could go outside. They received radio transmissions from the broader wasteland. They knew, as the decades passed, that the outside world was not as deadly as they told their residents, that the radiation levels had dropped to manageable levels, that communities had formed and economies had developed, and the wasteland was inhabited by people who had found ways to live in it. None of this information was shared with the residents of Vault 101. The story of perpetual deadly contamination continued to be told and to be believed, because the people who knew it was false had strong institutional reasons to maintain it. The vault's social structure, built on this foundation of fear and controlled information, produced the kind of governance that such foundations tend to produce: authoritarian, rigid, deeply resistant to change, capable of sustaining itself through the management of information rather than through genuine legitimacy. The overseers of Vault 101 were not uniformly bad people. Some of them were genuinely devoted to the welfare of the community they led, but all of them operated within a system that required them to lie to the people they were responsible for, and that requirement shaped the kind of leaders they became and the kind of community that resulted. The fracture came when a scientist named James left the vault to pursue a project he had been working on quietly for years: Project Purity, an attempt to clean the water of the Potomac River. James's departure was unauthorized, unannounced, and impossible for the vault's administrative systems to address after the fact. He was gone. The door had opened, and the residents of Vault 101 had to confront, suddenly and without preparation, the fact that people could leave. The story that had held for 200 years was false. This is where the lone wanderer's story begins, with the departure of a father who loved them and had reasons the wanderer did not yet know, and with the breaking open of a world whose entire existence had been premised on the impossibility of departure. The wanderer follows. They leave the vault into a blinding, bewildering surface world. They find it is not deadly in the way they were told. They find their father, eventually, at the cost of a complicated journey through a wasteland full of people and factions and histories that 200 years of vault closure had made invisible to them. The story of the lone wanderer in the capital wasteland is, at its root, the story of someone who was lied to about the fundamental nature of their world, who found the truth, and who had to figure out what to do with it. That is a universal story, dressed in the specific clothes of the Fallout universe. We are all, in some way, people who were told things that weren't quite true, who eventually encountered something that made those things visible as untrue, and who then had to decide what kind of person we were going to be in the aftermath of that knowledge. Vault 108 tells a very different story, and perhaps the most darkly comedic story in the Vault network, though the comedy is built on a foundation of genuine horror in the way that the best dark comedy always is. The experiment was designed around leadership, conflict, and cloning technology, a combination that, in retrospect, seems to have been either very naive about the potential consequences or very deliberate in the specific outcome it was trying to produce. The Vault contained a functional cloning system, a significant piece of biotechnology for the period, and a population structure that made no particular provision for managing the social consequences of that technology's existence. The experiment was designed to study what happens to community dynamics and leadership structures when the technology to create exact copies of individuals is available. A man named Gary became the dominant figure in the Vault at some point in its history. The records around this transition are not entirely clear, and whatever clarity they might once have had appears to have been disrupted by the events that the Gary problem eventually produced. What is clear is that the cloning system became associated with Gary, that Gary clones were produced, that those clones were Gary in some meaningful sense, and that over time the cloning process became the primary means of population management in the Vault. Gary clones are not people in any conventional sense. They are beings who share the physical form and some vocalization pattern of a person who is described nowhere in the records with any specificity, who has become a kind of distributed presence throughout the Vault. They are enormously numerous, deeply territorial, capable of saying only one word, Gary, in a variety of tones that manage to convey a remarkable range of meaning, and constitutionally hostile to anyone who is not a Gary. The diversity of human experience, the full range of personalities and capabilities and individual identities that the Vault's original population would have contained, has been replaced by a single name. Just Gary. Many, many Garys. There is a scientific tragedy buried under the darkly comedic surface of all this. Vault 108 had real researchers, real research programs, real scientific goals. The terminal records, before they stopped being regular, document genuine work. There were people in this Vault who had serious purposes and who pursued those purposes with professional dedication. Whatever happened with Gary, those people and their work and their purposes were ended by it, and the Vault that was once home to functioning science is now a monument to the specific kind of institutional failure that happens when a single variable overwhelms every other consideration in a closed system. The Gary situation continues to operate without external input. The cloning system runs. The Garys maintain the Vault in their own way. The lone wanderer who enters Vault 108 in Fallout 3 encounters something that is genuinely dangerous, genuinely strange, and possessed of the particular quality that makes the best Fallout encounters memorable. It is unmistakably, irreducibly Gary. Vault 114, in the Commonwealth of former Massachusetts, was designed with a kind of philosophical precision that is almost admirable in its focus. It targeted a specific assumption about how social status works specifically, the assumption of wealthy Americans that their status was inherent, transferable to any context, and deserved in ways that transcended the specific social conditions that had produced it. The Vault was presented to its intended population as a premium facility. The wealthy residents of pre-war Boston received invitations to Vault 114 with the understanding that it represented the best available option, the Vault for people of their caliber. The amenities would be superior. The company would be exclusive. Everything about it would reflect the social position they had earned and expected to maintain. The overseer, on the other hand, was selected specifically to undermine that expectation. A working-class man given total authority over a population of people who had spent their lives expecting deference. This was the experiment. What happens to people accustomed to commanding when they are placed in a situation where they must obey? How does the removal of social status that has been experienced as inherent affect the psychology and behavior of the people from whom it has been removed? The vault never finished sealing, which meant the experiment never fully ran. The construction was still ongoing on October 23, 2077, when the bombs fell, and the chaos of that moment meant that the facility could not provide the protection that vaults were built to provide. The intended residents who arrived found their luxury vault still unfinished, a final, devastating irony that their wealth and social connections had bought them a spot in a shelter that was not ready to be a shelter. Nick Valentine, found in Vault 114 during Fallout 4's narrative, carries the weight of that complexity in his own history. He is one of the series' more affecting figures, a pre-war detective whose memories and personality were implanted in a Generation 2 synth, who woke up in the vault decades after the war, as a being who was genuinely uncertain about what he was, and who built a life in the Commonwealth as Diamond City's detective while carrying that uncertainty with him always, like a coat he had never quite been able to take off. His presence in the vault is explained by the story of pre-war crime and betrayal and post-war politics that the game unfolds around him, and it is a story worth experiencing directly, slowly, the way he tells it. Part 13. The Vaults of Identity, Vault 115, and the question of who we are underground. The vault experiments that loom largest in the popular imagination: Vault 11's Annual Sacrifice, Vault 112's Virtual Hell, Vault 87's Super Mutant Factory are the ones whose horror is clearest and most dramatic. But some of the most philosophically interesting experiments in the Vault network are the ones that operated at a smaller scale, testing not what happens when communities are pushed toward violence or biological transformation, but what happens to identity itself when the context that normally sustains it is removed. Identity, the sense of who we are, what we value, where we come from, what we owe to each other, is not as stable as it feels from the inside. It is built and maintained through continuous interaction with the social and physical environment. We know who we are partly through other people's recognition of us, partly through the routines and practices that constitute daily life, partly through the objects and places and relationships that anchor our self-conception in something external. Remove those anchors and the identity they support becomes uncertain in ways that can be genuinely destabilizing. The vault environment removed most of those anchors by definition. Even the control vaults, the ones designed to function as genuine shelters, created conditions in which the normal supports of identity were substantially altered. There were no seasons underground. There was no night and day except what the lighting systems produced. There was no horizon, no weather, no landscape, no natural world in any form. The social environment was fixed at the moment of sealing the same people, in the same space, for years or decades, with no new arrivals and no exits. Whatever you had been before you entered the vault, you were now, above all things, a vault dweller. The experiment vaults amplified this effect through their specific designs. The residents of Vault 11 became, above all things, participants in the annual sacrifice system. The residents of Vault 21 became, above all things, gamblers. The residents of Vault 19 became, above all things, members of their sector, red or blue, before they were anything else. Identity in the vaults was shaped by the experimental conditions in ways that the residents could not see because they were inside those conditions, living them, experiencing them as simply the way things were. This is one of the more disturbing aspects of the vault experiment when you look at it from the outside. The experiments did not just test human behavior. They manufactured the humans who would exhibit that behavior. The communities in the vaults were not independent variables that Vault Tech was studying from a distance. They were, over time, the products of the conditions Vault Tech had created. By the time any given vaults experiment had been running for a generation, the children born inside it had no reference point outside it. They did not know who they might have become in different circumstances. They had only the circumstances. The vault stories are, in this sense, stories about what it means to be shaped by conditions you did not choose and cannot see clearly. And that is not merely a philosophical abstraction about fictional characters in an imaginary post-apocalyptic world. It is a description of the human condition more generally. We are all, to varying degrees, the products of circumstances we did not select and systems we inhabit so completely that they are difficult to perceive as systems at all. The vault simply makes that reality visible by compressing and intensifying it, by making the shaping conditions explicit in the records that survive. The records themselves are part of what makes the vault stories so unusually resonant. Unlike most historical tragedies, which we know about through the accounts of survivors and witnesses filtered through time and memory, and the various interests of those who recorded and preserved the information, the vault records are immediate. They are the actual terminal entries, the actual audio logs, the actual notes left by the people who were living through the events they document. The clinical language of the Vault Tech administrators sits alongside the desperate personal journals of residents trying to understand what was happening to them and to their community. The gap between those two registers, between the bureaucratic and the human, is where the horror lives. Dr. Lee, in Fallout 3, references the complexity of Vault social dynamics when discussing her own pre-war experiences. Madison Lee was not a vault dweller in the way the residents of the experiment vaults were, but she understood something about the psychology of closed systems from her own work, and her understanding shapes some of the most thoughtful dialogue in the game about what it means to build a community in conditions of isolation and stress. The vaults, she suggests, were not just laboratories for studying human behavior. They were machines for producing specific kinds of human beings. And the tragedy is that the specific kinds the machines were calibrated to produce were precisely the kinds least capable of building the flourishing post-war civilization that the experiment was ostensibly designed to serve. A civilization built on the ruins of communities that were destroyed by deliberate design is not the same as a civilization built on the resilience of communities that survived despite adversity. The Enclave wanted the former. What the Wasteland got was the latter. And the latter, however painful and complicated and violent its emergence was, turns out to be more interesting. Part 14. The long silence: what happens in vaults that left no records. For every vault whose story we know in detail, the terminal entries that survived, the audio logs that recorded the crucial moments, the physical evidence that tells its story through the logic of its arrangement, there are others whose stories we can only partially reconstruct, and others still whose records are simply gone. Vaults that sealed and whose doors have not been opened by the time of the games. Vaults that opened but whose contents have not been found. Vaults that exist in the lore as references without associated locations, whose experiments we know about in outline but whose details, the specific people, the specific choices, the specific moments when the experiment's parameters collided with the humanity of its subjects are lost. These silent vaults are, in some ways, the most haunting part of the network. We know they existed. We know something happened inside them. We cannot say what. The people who lived and died within them are not just characters in an undiscovered story. They are human experiences that left no recoverable trace. The Fallout universe is unusual among post-apocalyptic settings in its deep attention to the question of what survives and what doesn't. Most of what we know about the pre-war world in the games comes from fragments that the Great War left intact, buildings that didn't collapse entirely, filing cabinets that didn't burn, terminals that have been running on backup power for 2 centuries, preserving records that no one was still there to delete. The selective survival of information creates a picture of the pre-war world that is necessarily partial and necessarily shaped by the accidents of what physical locations were preserved and who had the motivation and ability to find and access them. The vaults, with their self-sustaining power systems and their sealed construction, are among the most reliable preservers of pre-war records in the Fallout universe. But even among the vaults, the records that survive depend on which vaults have been found and opened, which terminals are still functional, and which events within the vaults were documented by someone who had both the presence of mind and the means to do so. The most desperate moments of the most desperate vaults are often the ones least documented, because documentation requires resources that people in crisis are not always able to allocate. Think about what this means. There are human stories, complete human lives with all their complexity and contradiction, playing out in the dark of sealed vaults across the fictional geography of the Fallout universe that we will never know, communities that formed and held together or fell apart, individuals who made choices that cost them everything or choices that saved everyone around them, love stories, moral crises, moments of extraordinary courage, and moments of terrible failure. All of it sealed inside concrete and steel, generating no light that can be seen from outside, leaving no trace that can be recovered. The silent vaults are a reminder that the vault stories we do know are not the full picture. They are the readable surface of something much larger and much darker, most of which has been lost or hidden, or simply never found. The horror of the vault experiment is not just the specific horrors we have documented tonight. It is the totality of what was done to the people who were sealed inside. the vast majority of which happened without witness and without record and without any possibility of recovery. This is also, in a different key, what the vault stories say about history more generally. Most of what has happened to most human beings throughout history left no recoverable record. The lives that were not documented, the suffering that was not witnessed, the choices that were made in private without anyone around to record them, all of this is gone, permanently. And what we know about human experience is the small fraction of it that happened to be preserved by the accidents of survival and the interests of those who did the preserving. The vault experiment is, among other things, an extraordinary compression of that general condition, the condition of being human in a world that does not keep systematic track of the experience of most of the humans in it. The terminal entries we find in the vaults are, in this light, not just records of what happened in specific experiments. They are monuments to the general fact of unwitnessed human experience. They survived. They are here. We can read them. Most of what happened to most people in most vaults is not here, and we cannot read it, and we should carry that absence with us as we move through the stories we can tell. Part 15. The Overseer's Burden: What It Means to Run an Experiment You Know Is Wrong. The overseers of the Vault Network occupy a unique and deeply uncomfortable moral position in the Fallout universe. They were, in almost all cases, people who knew more about what was really happening in their vault than the residents did. They were the institutional interface between Vault-Tech's experimental design and the human community that was living inside that design. They had authority, and they had knowledge, and they had responsibility, and in most cases those three things pointed in different directions simultaneously. The moral landscape of the overseers is not simple. Some of them were genuinely committed to the experimental protocols they had been assigned, carrying out their instructions with the detached professionalism of people who had decided that the institutional goals they served were more important than the individual welfare of the people they were watching. Some of them were deeply uncomfortable with what they were doing, and showed that discomfort in various ways in the records they kept, in the small choices they made to mitigate the experiment's worst effects without technically violating its parameters, in the moments of personal anguish that surface in their personal logs, alongside the official documentation, and a few of them, a crucial, important few, chose differently. They looked at what they had been sent to do and decided they were not going to do it. Dr. Olivet of Vault 81. The overseer of Vault 101 who built his identity around keeping his community together, even at the cost of lying to them, a choice with its own moral complexity. The overseer of Vault 92, who may have modified the white noise parameters in ways that reduce the severity of their effects. The records here are ambiguous, but some researchers believe the evidence supports this reading. These overseer stories are important because they locate moral agency at the point of implementation. Vault-Tech's experimental designs were made in corporate offices and approved by institutional processes that distributed responsibility across so many people and so many layers of hierarchy that no single individual had to face the full moral weight of what the system was doing. The overseer was the point where all of that distributed institutional machinery resolved into a single person standing in front of actual human beings and making choices that had direct consequences for those people's lives. It is, in many ways, the most familiar moral situation in the real world. The person at the institutional interface, the point where policy becomes practice, where the distant decisions of administrators and policymakers and executives become the immediate reality of people who are actually affected by them. The overseer in the vault is the teacher who can follow the curriculum or adapt it to serve the actual students in front of them. The administrator who can apply the policy as written or find room within it for human judgment. The supervisor who can enforce the rule or recognize when enforcing it serves no one. The Vault Overseer stories are so affecting precisely because they make this familiar situation extreme and visible. Dr. Olivet did not make a small adjustment to soften a difficult policy. She sabotaged the experiment entirely. She chose the people in front of her over the institutional goals she had been assigned. And the consequences of that choice rippled forward for 200 years and produced, among other things, Curie, a being who would not have existed in anything like her actual form if the experiment had run as designed. The small choices matter. The large choices matter more. But both of them matter. And the Vault stories are, in part, a meditation on the point at which individual moral agency intersects with institutional power and what a person can do there if they are willing to bear the cost. The moral weight of these overseer stories does not diminish with distance or with the fictional framing. They remain, at their core, stories about the point at which individual moral courage either meets institutional power or fails to. And what makes them worth returning to, what makes them the kind of stories that stay with you after the controller is set down or the video ends, is precisely that they refuse the comfortable resolution. The overseers who chose their people did not save everyone. Dr. Olivet's choice to protect Vault 81's residents did not prevent the Great War or heal the wasteland, or give Curie a fuller life than 83 years of solitary confinement in a research wing. It just meant that when someone came through the door, 200 years later, there was a living community on the other side of it and a robot who had kept her promise. That was all. That was enough. The overseers who chose the experiment did not accomplish the great work of post-war civilization building that Vault-Tec promised their data would enable. They produced suffering and death, and the long echoes of both in the communities that emerged from their vaults. What their choice cost the people in their care is not fully calculable. What it cost them personally in the quiet of the records they left, in the moments when the official language slips and the human reality of what they were doing surfaces briefly through the institutional prose, is clear enough. The ones who chose the experiment over the people did not, in the end, get to live in the world that their choices were supposed to help build. The Enclave's vision did not materialize. The post-war civilization that Vault-Tec's data was supposed to enable never arrived. What arrived instead was the wasteland, which had no use for them. Part 16. Smaller Vaults, Stranger Stories Vault 77, Vault 3, and Vault 118. Not every Vault experiment was a sweeping study in community collapse or large-scale behavioral modification. Some of them were smaller in ambition and stranger in concept, occupying the experimental catalog with a kind of off-kilter specificity that says something about the range of hypotheses Vault-Tec was willing to test. These smaller Vault stories are sometimes easier to tell and harder to fully understand, because their strangeness resists the kind of clean narrative arc that makes the larger experiments legible. Vault 77 was a vault designed around the question of what happens to a single person in complete isolation with one twist. The vault contained a single human resident, but it also contained a large quantity of puppets. Not automated robots, not AI companions, not any form of genuinely interactive presence, puppets. Fabric and string and the inanimate potential for personality, waiting for someone to give them voice. The lone resident of Vault 77, who has come to be known in the Fallout community as the Puppet Man, though the records do not give a name, had been placed in a vault designed to test the outer limits of human social need. What does a person do when there is no one else? When every social instinct and every communication skill and every capacity for emotional connection has nowhere to go except inward or into the available substitutes. The Puppet Man gave the puppets personalities. He gave them names and backstories and relationships with each other and with him. He conducted conversations and arguments and negotiations and reconciliations with beings that could not respond except as he made them respond. He built, in the most literal possible sense, his entire social world from scratch, using the materials available to him. The records of this discovered in a Fallout 3 webcomic, later referenced in the games themselves, are simultaneously heartbreaking and something close to inspiring. The Puppet Man's situation was designed to be impossible. A human being cannot flourish without genuine social connection, and the puppets were not genuine social connection. But what the Puppet Man did with the situation he was given, the creativity and the commitment, and the sheer force of human meaning-making he brought to those fabric figures, is a testament to the depth of the human drive to connect, even when connection is not available in any real form. He eventually left the vault. He made it to the capital wasteland. He brought the puppets with him. There are reports from travelers in the wasteland who encountered him there, still with the puppets, still maintaining the relationships he had built in the vault. The experiment was designed to study what isolation does to a person. What it actually documented was what a person does to isolation. Vault 3, in the Mojave Desert, is one of the few control vaults in the network, a facility designed to function without a deliberate experimental variable, housing its community in something approaching normal vault conditions. The residents of Vault 3 sealed themselves inside in 2077 and maintained a functioning community for generations, producing children and grandchildren who had never seen the surface world but who had built a stable and relatively peaceful society underground. Their undoing came not from any internal failure but from a structural accident. A water pipe in the vault's lower levels developed a slow leak that eventually required the opening of the vault's doors to effect repairs. The decision to open the doors was a reasonable maintenance choice made by a community that had, by that point, spent decades in relative peace and had no particular reason to fear what was outside. What was outside, in that part of the Mojave at that time, was the Fiends, a faction of drug-addicted raiders known for their violence and their total indifference to the norms of the wasteland's limited social order. The Fiends found the open vault door, and they went inside and they killed the residents they found there, and they claimed the vault as their base of operations. The community that had survived the Great War and maintained itself for generations in underground safety was destroyed in a matter of hours by a water leak and the consequences of opening a door at the wrong moment. Vault 3, when the courier of Fallout New Vegas finds it, is a raider stronghold, the Fiend's home base, filled with everything that implies. The vault's original residents are all dead. Their community, their records, their generations of accumulated history underground are gone. The vault itself remains, now serving a completely different population for completely different purposes, as indifferent to its history as any space that has changed hands by violence tends to be. The lesson of Vault 3, if it has one, is that the worst outcome does not always come from the experiment. Sometimes it comes from a water pipe. Vault 118, accessible in the Far Harbor DLC of Fallout 4, was designed around a class experiment similar in concept to Vault 114, but different in its specific design. It was divided between wealthy and working-class residents, a physical division of the population that created two distinct communities within the same sealed space, separated by social class rather than administrative assignment. The wealthy residents had better accommodations, better food synthesis equipment, better recreational facilities. The working-class residents had the maintenance access, the operational knowledge, the skills that kept the vault running. This division resources versus expertise was the experimental variable. Vault-Tec wanted to know how an economy based on those two things would develop over time, whether the resource advantage of the wealthy would dominate the expertise advantage of the working class, or whether the working class would leverage their indispensable skills into a more equal power relationship. By the time the Far Harbor DLC events bring the sole survivor to Vault 118, the human drama of the original experiment has been suspended in an unexpected way. The wealthy residents are all dead, and the working-class residents are all robots, having transferred their consciousnesses into android bodies to achieve a kind of immortality that the technology made available. The vault is now populated by robot former working-class residents, maintaining the facilities for wealthy former residents who are gone, which is either an extraordinary irony or an extraordinary commentary on the relationship between work and capital, depending on how you look at it. A murder mystery involving these robot residents is the core quest of the Vault 118 storyline, and it is one of the more genuinely funny and genuinely dark pieces of content in Fallout 4's DLC catalog. The robots have, in the centuries since the transfer, developed all the social complexity and interpersonal resentment of the human community they originally were, which means that a vault full of immortal robots is experiencing the same petty conflicts and status anxieties and interpersonal vendettas that the original residents experienced, simply without the convenient resolution that mortality eventually provides. The vault's experiment about class dynamics produced, in the end, a vault full of immortal robots having arguments about who gets to sit where at dinner, which is perhaps the most honest possible commentary on what class conflict ultimately reduces to, given enough time and enough removed consequences. Part 17. The Architecture of Memory. What terminal logs tell us about the people who wrote them. One of the most unusual qualities of the Vault stories, as narrative experiences, is the medium through which they are primarily told. Most of what we know about the people who lived in the vaults we know through terminal entries, the electronic logs that Vault residents kept for official and personal purposes, which have been preserved on the Vault's self-sustaining power systems and are accessible to the player character who enters and investigates. Terminal entries are a strange form of human expression. They occupy a space somewhere between journal writing and official record, and most Vault residents who wrote them seem to have been uncertain about which mode they were in at any given moment. The official entries, the maintenance logs, the administrative records, the experiment documentation produced by overseers and research staff are written in the institutional language of bureaucratic competence. They use passive voice and technical terminology, and the kind of careful precision that suggests someone who is very aware that they are creating an official record and wants to be seen as doing their job correctly. But the personal entries, the private logs, the diary-like records that residents kept for their own purposes are something else. They are immediate and unguarded in the way that writing for yourself tends to be, and they contain the texture of daily life in the vaults in a way that the official records do not. They contain complaints about the food and observations about the light, and notes about relationships and worries about the future and moments of genuine joy, set down in the electronic equivalent of a private notebook by people who were trying to hold on to something, their sense of themselves, their sense of the life they were living in conditions that made that holding on difficult. Reading these personal logs is, repeatedly, one of the most emotionally affecting experiences in the Fallout games. Not because they describe dramatic events, often they don't. Often they describe the small, ordinary things that make up most of a life, but because they are so clearly the records of real people, or at least of characters written with enough humanity that they function as real people who were going through something very difficult and were trying to process it with the limited tools available to them. The terminal logs of Vault 11's residents are particularly rich examples. They were kept over generations, and reading across them you can watch the cultural evolution of a community, the language shifting, the references changing, the concerns that dominate the logs moving from the acute crisis of the early years to the normalized anxiety of the middle generations to the strange, resigned pragmatism of the later records, in which the annual sacrifice is simply a fact of life to be managed, rather than an atrocity to be resisted. The normalization is the horror. You can watch it happen, entry by entry, across decades. The logs of Vault 87's researchers, in the period before the FEV experiment overwhelmed the facility, tell a different kind of story. The story of scientists who believed in what they were doing, who had convinced themselves that the experiment they were conducting was genuinely important and genuinely justified, and who recorded their work in the language of confident professional competence right up until the point when the records stop. The sudden absence is more disturbing than any description of what happened would be. You know something terrible occurred, the records simply end. And then there are the logs that were written in the final hours, the entries that were made by people who knew they were not going to make more entries, who were setting down their last words in the only medium available to them, in the hope that someone would eventually find the terminal and read what they had written. These are the most painful documents in the Vault archive. They are love letters to the future, written by people with no reason to believe the future would care about them, preserved by the accident of terminal functionality across 2 centuries of abandonment. Someone reads them. That's the point. The player character reads them. We read them, translated into game text that we encounter in the course of playing. The person who wrote that last entry, in the terrible last hours of some Vault disaster, did not know that someone would eventually come and open the door and find the terminal and press the key. But someone did. Someone always does in the Fallout games, because the games are structured around the act of finding and reading these records. There is something important in that. The Vault experiments were designed to produce data. What they actually produced, among many other things, was testimony. The records that survive from the vaults are not scientific data in any meaningful sense. They are too partial, too personal, too shaped by the limited perspectives of the individuals who wrote them to constitute the kind of objective measurement that Vault-Tech's researchers wanted. But they are testimony. They are the record of specific people's experiences in specific circumstances, preserved in the particular medium of electronic text, waiting for someone who would eventually come and read and understand. The Fallout games built their world around these records. The environmental storytelling that makes the Vault stories so powerful is constructed from these fragments, the terminal entries and the audio logs and the physical arrangements of space and object that together produce a picture of what happened. That is more affecting, precisely because it requires assembly by the person experiencing it. You do not receive the story. You discover it piece by piece from the evidence that has survived. And the act of discovery of finding the next terminal, listening to the next log, seeing what the next room contains, is an act of bearing witness. The people who died in the vaults deserve witnesses. Their lives were taken from them, or at least shaped and damaged and in many cases ended by an institution that treated them as data points rather than people. The minimum we can do, in the fictional space of the games that tell their stories, is to find the records and read them carefully, and try to understand what they mean. That is what the games ask us to do. It is, in a strange way, a form of moral reckoning not with real events, but with the structures and systems that real events of this kind implicate. The vaults were built by people who believed other people were manageable. The records those vaults preserved are proof that the people inside them were not manageable. They were particular, specific, irreducible human beings whose individuality survived even the most sustained institutional pressure to reduce them to data. Their names are in the terminal entries. Their voices are in the audio logs. Their choices are written into the physical space of the vaults themselves, in the rooms they arranged, the walls they marked, the things they left behind. They are here. We can read them. That is more than the vault tech designers ever intended, and it is exactly what the people inside the vaults deserved. Part 18. The wider web vault tech's legacy in the wasteland we inherited. There is a conversation that happens, sometimes, among people who spend a lot of time in the Fallout universe. It goes something like this. Which faction in the post-war world came closest to being right? The Brotherhood of Steel, with their technological preservation and their hierarchical discipline? The New California Republic, with their democratic idealism and their expansionist pragmatism? The Institute, with their scientific program and their contempt for the surface world? The various smaller factions, the Minutemen, the Railroad, the Kings, the Great Khans, each with their particular vision of what the wasteland could be? The conversation is genuinely interesting because the Fallout games are sophisticated enough to show the real costs and real benefits of each faction's approach, without resolving the argument cleanly in any direction. What makes the question particularly complex is that every faction that exists in the post-war world is, in some sense, a product of the Vault system. The NCR emerged from Vault 15. The Institute emerged from the survivors and technologists of the greater Boston area, shaped by decades of proximity to the Institute's clandestine operations. The Brotherhood of Steel emerged from military and scientific communities that were already, before the bombs fell, embedded in the same power structures that Vault Tech operated within. The Vaults were not just laboratories for testing human behavior. They were incubators for the factions that would fight over the wasteland for the next 2 centuries. The experimental conditions that Vault Tech designed became, for the communities that survived them, formative experiences that shaped their values, their governance structures, their relationship to authority and outsiders and the outside world. The Boomers are the most obvious example, a community whose entire cultural identity was forged in the crucible of Vault 34's weapons surplus and the political conflict over disarmament. But the pattern is much broader. Consider what the successful vaults produced. Not just the experiment vaults that survived their own experiments, but the control vaults whose populations eventually emerged and began rebuilding. These communities carried with them the specific culture of their vaults, the governance structures that had developed over decades of enclosed life, the social norms that had been built and refined in the specific conditions of sealed underground existence, the particular ways of organizing collective life that their vault circumstances had made necessary and then made natural. These vault-born cultures met each other on the surface, and the meeting was not always smooth. Communities that had developed in isolation for generations, each with their own internally coherent set of norms and expectations, often found that their particular vault culture did not translate easily to the social landscape of the wasteland, where dozens of different cultural streams were suddenly in contact with each other. The conflicts that resulted over resources, over governance, over what values should take precedence in the new world were not just conflicts between competing interests. They were conflicts between competing cultures, each of which had legitimate roots in the specific history of the vault that had produced it. The wasteland that the Fallout games are set in is, in this sense, the direct consequence of Vault Tech's experimental program. Not in the way that Vault Tech intended, not the managed, data-rich emergence of a controlled population shaped by deliberately designed experiences and available for institutional management by the Enclave's successors, but in a much more chaotic and much more human way. The vaults produced people who were particular, specific, shaped by their circumstances in ways that could not be entirely predicted or controlled. And those people came out into the world and did what people do. They argued and cooperated and fought and loved and built things and destroyed things and tried to make sense of what had happened to them. The wasteland is what you get when you do that for 200 years. The NCR and the Brotherhood and the Institute and the Minutemen and the Great Khans and the powder gangers, and the boomers, and everyone else in the post-war landscape, they are all, in various ways, the long consequence of Vault-Tech's great experiment in human management. The experiment produced exactly what it was designed to produce, in the sense that the vaults shaped the people who emerged from them, in ways that are clearly traceable. It did not produce what Vault-Tech intended, in the sense that the people who emerged were not manageable in the way the plan assumed. The plan assumed that data about human behavior under controlled conditions would allow the post-war world's power structure to predict and manage the behavior of the emerging population. What it actually produced was 2 centuries of human experience that generated more complexity and more particularity and more irreducible individual character than any dataset could have captured or any management structure could have contained. The wasteland is ungovernable. That is its most essential quality. Every faction that tries to govern it completely discovers, sooner or later, that the people in it are too varied and too stubborn and too shaped by their own specific histories to be organized into any structure that doesn't leave room for the full mess of what they actually are. The Enclave failed to govern it because the surface population they disdained turned out to be too resilient and too resourceful and too unwilling to accept the role they had been assigned. The Brotherhood of Steel fails repeatedly to build stable governance because its hierarchical rigidity cannot accommodate the diversity of the Wasteland's communities. The NCR comes closer, but its expansion creates exactly the kind of institutional distance from the people it governs that tends to produce the corruption and the inefficiency that the games document. The Vaults produced all of this. The Vaults produced the resilience and the stubbornness and the irreducible particularity that makes the Wasteland ungovernable. Because the Vaults also produced, in the spaces between their experiments, the people who refused, the people who chose, the people who decided that the institutional goals of the organization that had sealed them underground were less important than the human beings they were sharing that underground with. Dr. Olivet refused, and 200 years later, there was Curie, curious about everything. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 refused, and 4 of them took their own lives from guilt, but 1 of them walked out, and the walking out mattered even if we don't know what came after. The lone wanderer left Vault 101, following the only person they loved, into a world they had been told was deadly, and the world was not deadly, and the story they had been told was not true, and they had to figure out everything from scratch. The sole survivor stepped out of a pod into a world 210 years past what they had known, looking for their child, and kept looking until they found what they were looking for and understood what it had cost. These are the Vault stories. Not the ones Vault-Tech wanted to tell, the ones that happened anyway, in the spaces the experiment could not control. Because the experiment could not control everything, because the people inside the vaults were people and people are not, in the end, manageable. That is the real finding of Vault-Tech's great experiment. The one that nobody in Vault-Tech's corporate hierarchy planned for, and that the Enclave never got to use, and that the Fallout games tell over and over again in different forms across 6 games and 30 years of accumulated lore. People are not manageable. They are remarkable. They are terrible. They are capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage. They are shaped by their circumstances in deep and lasting ways. They carry their histories in their bodies and in their cultures and in the stories they tell about themselves and each other. But they are not manageable. And they were never going to be. And the Vaults, for all their sealed doors and controlled variables and carefully designed experimental parameters, produced more proof of that than any other institution in human history. That is the legacy the Vaults left behind, not the Enclave's dream of managed human emergence from the darkness. The Wasteland's reality of unmanageable human variety, stubbornness, tragedy, grace, and the endless, exhausting, genuinely hopeful work of people trying to live decently in conditions that were designed to make decent living impossible. Part 11. The Frozen Family Vault, 111. Some stories are personal. Some stories are not about the fate of communities or the outcomes of social experiments or the political consequences of institutional decisions. Some stories are about one person and one child and 200 years of cryogenic sleep, and what survives in a person when everything else has been taken from them. Vault 111 is the vault you start in Fallout 4. It is the first vault you ever see in that game, and it is the one whose story you carry through everything that follows, because its story is your story, the story of the sole survivor, who woke up from cryogenic sleep into a world that had moved on without them. The vault sits in the hills north of the ruins of Boston, its entrance concealed beneath what appears to be an ordinary maintenance facility, a structure that, in the pre-war world, would have attracted no particular attention from the passing neighborhood. The vault beneath it was designed for cryogenic research. Its residents would be frozen in preservation pods, their vital signs maintained by automated medical systems, their consciousness held in suspension for an indefinite period, while Vault Tech researchers studied the physiological effects of long-term cryogenic storage on human subjects. The residents selected for Vault 111 were not informed of the specific nature of what they had signed up for. They were told that the vault used advanced preservation technology, which was true. They were told that they would be in a state of suspended animation, which was also true. What they were not told was that their frozen bodies would be the experimental subjects, and that the plan for when and how they would be thawed was not their decision to make. The sole survivor and their family spouse and infant son Sean were among the last group to reach the vault's entrance on the day the bombs fell. The chaos of that morning, the sirens and the running, and the Vault Tech representatives processing people with the brisk efficiency of an organization that had been planning for exactly this moment, was frightening even before the first distant flash made the scale of what was happening impossible to ignore. They made it through the airlock. They were processed. They were directed to their pods. They stepped inside. The cryogenic process worked exactly as designed. The sole survivor and their family were frozen at the moment of the Great War and remained frozen for 210 years, their vital signs monitored by automated systems that had been running continuously since October 23, 2077, maintaining the temperature and the biological parameters and the thousands of small calibrations that keep a human being alive in a state of suspended animation. The world above them changed completely during those 210 years. The fire, the initial devastation, the long, slow process of radioactive decay and ecological disruption and human survival, the emergence of new communities and factions and economies from the ruins of the old one, all of it happened while the sole survivor slept in a sealed vault that had been designed to preserve them. What woke them, what ended 210 years of suspended sleep, was not an authorized thaw. It was a man named Kellogg, working on behalf of the Institute, a secretive scientific organization operating in deep secrecy beneath the ruins of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who entered the vault 60 years into the sole survivors' sleep. Kellogg wanted Sean, the baby boy who had been frozen alongside his parents, whose pre-war genetic code unaltered by radiation, unmutated by post-war biology, the Institute had identified as essential to their research. The Institute was building synthetic humans, and they needed a source of pre-war human DNA that the 2 centuries of the wasteland's history had not touched. A baby sealed in a cryogenic pod on the day of the Great War was exactly what they needed. Kellogg thawed the pods. He took Sean. He killed the sole survivor's spouse efficiently, without ceremony, as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be addressed. He refroze the sole survivor, and he left. The sole survivor woke again 60 years after that, when the vault's failing systems began opening pods in sequence. From their perspective, from the inside of cryogenic sleep, where no time passes between going under and coming up, the 2 thawings were minutes apart. They watched their spouse's death through the frosted glass of a frozen pod. And then the pod opened, and they were standing in a vault that smelled of machine oil and the particular staleness of recycled air that hasn't moved in decades, surrounded by pods that had either failed or opened. Their spouse's body still there, the vault's systems running on backup power, the questions enormous and immediate and entirely without answers. They went outside. The elevator took them up. The door opened. The surface of the world is visible from just outside Vault 111's entrance, and what it reveals is the neighborhood the sole survivor lived in before the Great War. The same streets, the same shapes of houses, reduced by 2 centuries of weather and neglect, and the specific kind of decay that happens when a material world is no longer maintained by human attention, but still recognizable in outline. The robot that tended the family's garden is still there, still maintaining its programmed routines, because it was built to do that, and nothing has told it to stop. The wasteland beyond the neighborhood is not recognizable. The skyline of Boston's ruins is visible from elevated ground. The world has become something else entirely, but the shape of the familiar, laid over the bones of 2 centuries of devastation, is one of Fallout 4's most effective pieces of environmental storytelling. The home that was a home, the street that was a street, the garden that was a garden, all of it still here, in the shape of what it was, even though nothing about it is what it was anymore. The quest that drives Fallout 4's central narrative, the search for Sean, is, in its emotional core, not about the Institute or the synths or the political factions of the Commonwealth. It is about a parent trying to find their child. It is about the thing that survives in a person when 200 years have erased everything else, every social connection, every familiar face, every piece of the world they knew. What is left, when all of that is gone, is whatever was most essential. Whatever was, in the most literal sense, irreducible. For the sole survivor, what is left is the question of where their child is and whether they can still reach them. Sean, when the sole survivor finds him, is not the infant who was taken from the vault. He is an old man, the director of the Institute, having risen through the organization that raised him to lead it. He has lived a full life. He is brilliant and complicated and, in his way, genuinely caring about the sole survivor he has been watching through the Institute's surveillance systems for years. He is also dying. The Institute, for all its technological sophistication, has not solved cancer, and the time available for this reunion is limited. The conversation between a parent who has not aged and a child who has grown old without them is handled in Fallout 4 with a restraint that makes it more affecting than a more operatic treatment would have been. The things that are said and the things that are not said. The 2 centuries that neither of them can give the other back. The specific quality of a parent-child relationship that has been interrupted and resumed under conditions so strange that the normal emotional grammar doesn't quite apply. The cryogenic pods of Vault 111 preserve something that the experiment was not designed to preserve. The specific, irreducible fact of a particular person's love for their particular child. The experiment measured vital signs and core temperatures. It did not measure that. It could not. But it kept it alive all the same. 200 years in a pod, and when the door opened, the first coherent thought was, where is my child? That is the thing the vault preserved. That is the thing that no experiment, no institutional process, no amount of deliberate engineering could produce or contain or extinguish. The vault did exactly what it was designed to do. It could not preserve the life those subjects would have lived. It could not preserve the time. It could not preserve the relationship between a parent and their child across the gap that Kellogg's visit and 60 intervening years created. The cryogenic pods worked perfectly. Everything that mattered could not be frozen. Part 12. What the vaults left behind. Take a breath. Let the long night of vault settle into something you can carry. We have been underground for a long time now, walking corridors that smell of recycled air and old decisions, reading the records of communities that were built to fail in specific ways by people who believed they were doing science, or believed they were saving civilization, or believed they were doing what was necessary in a world that was not going to give them the luxury of doing what was right. We have seen the worst of what human institutions can do when they have total authority and no accountability. We have also seen, in the spaces between the horror, something that looks like grace. Vault-Tec designed its experiments with a specific assumption at the center of them, that human beings, under sufficient pressure and in conditions of sufficient control, can be reduced to predictable behavioral patterns. That given the right variables and the right environment, any outcome can be engineered. The vaults were the proof of concept. 105 sealed environments, each running a different version of the same underlying hypothesis. People are manageable. People are knowable. People, in the end, are data. Some of the vaults proved this right. Vault 11's community killed each other for 75 years because an authority figure told them they had to, and they complied with a consistency that any organizational psychologist would have found grimly instructive. Vault 92's musicians turned on each other under chemical manipulation they couldn't identify and couldn't resist. Vault 106's community dissolved into paranoid violence under the influence of drugs they didn't know they were breathing. Vault 34's residents nearly destroyed each other over who got to keep the weapons, and the ones who left took the weapons with them, and built a culture around artillery and isolation that has persisted for 200 years. These were, from the Vault-Tec perspective, successful experiments. They demonstrated what they were designed to demonstrate. The data was collected, the results were filed. The people inside were expendable. But then there are the other stories. Dr. Olivet, looking at her experiment and choosing her people. One woman, one decision, 200 years of consequences that rippled forward in ways she could not have anticipated, ending in a robot completing a cure in a sealed room and a sick child in a vault that should not have still been standing but was, because someone chose to protect it. The fifth survivor of Vault 11, walking out into the Mojave Desert with the weight of 75 years of community-sanctioned murder on their back and the strange, doubtful freedom of being alive when everyone they had known was gone. Walking anyway. That is not nothing. That is, in the specific way the Fallout universe tends to mean it, everything. Curie, developing her personality in the slow dark of a sealed research wing because a dying scientist gave her room to grow, and waiting 83 years after she finished the cure for someone to come and let her out, and when they came, going with them into a wasteland she had never seen, curious about everything, afraid of nothing, carrying in her memory the names of every pathogen she had catalogued, and the names of the scientists who died around her, and the specific French accent that is not a glitch but a self. The boomers of Nellis Air Force Base, who took their weapons and walked out of Vault 34 and made their home in the desert, and are simultaneously a legacy of Vault-Tech's failure and one of the more successful communities in the New Vegas region, isolated and strange and committed to their way of life in a way that reads as eccentricity until you understand the Vault history that produced it, at which point it reads as one possible answer to the question of how you build a community after everything has fallen apart. Sarah Weintraub, running her gift shop in the upper levels of Vault 21, telling the Vault story to anyone who asks. Preservation of a different kind than cryogenic pods or sealed food stores, the preservation of a history through the act of telling it, again and again, to whoever comes through the door. Fox, reading 200 years of books alone in a cell, waiting for someone to come and open a door that had been locked for reasons that had nothing to do with them. What the vaults left behind is not just the physical evidence of what happened inside them, the skeletons and the terminal logs and the instruments still in their cases, and the rooms arranged in patterns that tell their stories. Through the logic of their arrangement, what they left behind is the people who came out. The boomers and the spore carriers and the ghouls and the super mutants and the one survivor of Vault 11 who walked into the desert, and Curie exploring the Commonwealth, and the sole survivor standing outside a vault door with 210 years of sleep behind them, and the question of a missing child ahead of them. These people, these beings, these consciousnesses that the vault shaped and damaged, and occasionally somehow failed to destroy, went out and built the wasteland that the Fallout games are set in. Every faction and community and individual the player meets is downstream, in some way, from the choices that were made in the vaults and the choices that were made inside them. The Brotherhood of Steel and the NCR and the Institute and Diamond City and all the rest, the wasteland's complex political and social landscape is, partly, the long consequence of 122 sealed chambers running their programs in the dark. The vaults were Vault-Tech's attempt to manage the future, to control what came after the war by controlling the populations that would emerge from it, shaped by specific experiences designed to produce specific outcomes. The vaults were, in aggregate, a declaration that humanity could be engineered, that the variables of human social behavior could be understood and predicted and directed toward ends that a sufficiently powerful organization had chosen. What the vaults actually produced was the wasteland, not the wasteland that Vault-Tech planned for the one in which the surviving population emerged shaped and manageable, ready to be organized into whatever post-war civilization the Enclave had designed. The wasteland that actually exists, which is chaotic and violent, and full of suffering, and also full of people who have found extraordinary ways to love each other and build things worth having and maintain, in conditions that were designed to destroy it, the stubborn, inefficient, irreducible fact of human dignity. The fifth survivor walked out of Vault 11. Curie walked out of the research wing. The sole survivor stepped out into the light of a world they did not recognize, all of them carrying in their bodies the experience of what the vaults had done to them and the question of what they were going to do now with what remained. Every settlement in the wasteland is, in some sense, a vault, a sealed community making decisions about who belongs and what the rules are and what it owes to its members and to the strangers who come to the door. The experiment never ended. It just moved outside, where there is more space and more light and the variables are harder to control. The question Vault-Tech was trying to answer, the one they spent enormous pre-war resources and a vast institutional infrastructure, and the involuntary participation of hundreds of thousands of people to address is the same question human beings have been asking since the first. Communities formed around the first fires. What holds people together when everything is trying to pull them apart? The vaults gave expensive, complicated, tragic, occasionally beautiful answers. They proved, repeatedly and at great cost, that the things vault tech thought would hold people together, authority and information control, and engineered social pressure, and the deliberate management of scarcity, are less durable than the things that emerge from the people themselves. Friendship, loyalty, the specific love that one person can develop for another person in the conditions of the kind of shared difficulty that vaults were so efficient at producing. The refusal at some point to comply. The decision to protect the people in front of you even when the institutional structure you're embedded in is demanding something else. These things are not reliable. They don't always show up. The vaults are also full of evidence of their failure, the communities that couldn't hold together, the people who chose the system over each other, the overseers who ran their experiments with professional detachment and went to bed at night in the knowledge of what they were doing. Human beings contain multitudes, and the vaults explored all of them. But the other things are also there, in the records and the ruins, and the scattered evidence of the people who chose differently, at cost to themselves. In the dark, Dr. Olivet, the 5 who refused, Collins and his robot, the 5th survivor, Curie, waiting 83 years with the cure finished, scanning the same 4 walls, because she had promised to wait for someone to come. These are the moments that make the vault stories worth telling. Not because they redeem the horror they can't. The horror is too large and too deliberate to be redeemed by individual acts of courage or compassion. But because they make it mean something, because they show that the same sealed, pressurized, deliberately destructive conditions that produced the worst outcomes the vault network generated also produce these people, doing these things, and that the worst and the best came from the same source. The vaults are quiet now. Whatever was going to happen inside has already happened. The doors are open, most of them. Whatever was going to walk out has walked out. The stories they left behind are not finished. They are still being told in every settlement and every ruin and every character in the Fallout games who carries, in their history and their personality and their relationship to the world around them, the long echo of something that happened in a sealed room 200 years ago. That echo will keep sounding for a long time. We are still inside it. And that is where we leave the vaults tonight, hours underground, in the quiet and the dark, with the stories of people who did not know they were being watched, who built their lives and made their choices in the deepest privacy of sealed concrete walls, whose records survived to be found and read by people who came along centuries later and tried to understand what it all meant. If you are still with us, if the vaults kept you company through whatever quiet hours brought you here, then thank you. That means something to us, even if we cannot say exactly what. If these stories suit you, subscribe. There are more down here, waiting in the dark, more corridors to walk, more terminals to read, more records left by people who thought no one would ever find them. Leave a like if the vaults were good to you tonight. Drop a comment to let us know where you are and what time it is where you are watching. From the geography of who is lying in the dark listening to these stories is one of the genuinely lovely things about making them. Sleep well. The wasteland will be there when you wake up. It always is. A final note on listening to these stories. There is something that happens over the course of a long night spent with the vault stories that is hard to name precisely. It is not just the accumulation of narrative information, the facts of what each vault's experiment was and what happened to its residents. It is something more like the building of a felt understanding of a particular kind of human experience, the experience of being trapped, of being subject to systems that don't acknowledge your humanity, of trying to maintain your sense of yourself in conditions that were designed to reshape you into something more convenient. That experience is not fictional. It is not unique to the Fallout universe. The Vault stories are science fiction, set in an imaginary post-apocalyptic world, populated by characters who were invented by game writers and lore designers working at a game development company. But the experiences they describe the experiences of communities under institutional power, of individuals under systems that treat them as variables rather than people, of the moral choices that become available when someone with authority decides to use that authority differently than they were told to. These experiences are real, and they are current, and they are, in various forms, part of the world outside the game. The Fallout universe uses the extreme compression of its fictional circumstances to make visible things that are hard to see clearly in their normal, diffuse, complex form. The vaults make the relationship between institutional power and individual experience visible by making it stark. The sealed doors and the controlled variables and the experimental parameters remove the ambiguity that normally softens that relationship and make its structure clear. What is clear, when you look at it clearly, is that the people who run the systems and the people who are subject to the systems have fundamentally different relationships to what those systems are doing. The people who run the systems often do not experience, directly and personally, what the systems do to the people who are subject to them. They see data, results, outcomes. The people who are subject to the systems experience the systems as their lives, as the thing that is happening to them every day, in the specific and immediate form of the choices they are allowed to make and the choices that are made for them. The Vault stories honor the people who are subject to the systems. They tell their stories in their own words, through the terminal entries and audio logs and physical arrangements of space that those people left behind. They give voice to the specific and particular human experience of being inside an experiment that was designed without any concern for what that experience was like. That is why these stories are worth telling and worth listening to, even in the small hours when the world is quiet and you are trying to find your way to sleep. Because the people who were sealed in those vaults were not data points, they were people. And the act of telling their stories, of making the effort to understand what they went through and what they chose and what it cost them, is the minimum form of the witness that their experience deserves. Sleep well. You have listened. That matters.